Good evening. I'd like to call to order the San Carlos City Council meeting for March 28th, 2016. Please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We'd like to welcome back our colleague, Matt Grocott. It's good to see you, Matt. Welcome back. Do we have any changes to the order of the agenda?
No changes from staff this evening, Mr. Mayor.
Anyone else? Okay, we'll move on to item 4, council communications and announcements, and we'll start with Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Welcome back, Matt. The dais was kind of unbalanced without you down there. So I just wanted to mention to my colleagues that late last week I had heard from somebody involved in the Wheeler Plaza project that there may have been some changes being proposed or considered to the valet parking system that's kind of a linchpin during construction of dealing with the loss of the Wheeler Plaza parking spaces. I'm happy to say that talking to John McMorrow at Silverstone, he indicated to me that the essence and sort of the majority of the valet parking concept is still there, which I told him was very good because I had some very grave concerns about moving forward with the project if it was about to go away. So I think he heard that as well, and we'll see what comes back. I guess they're coming back to present to us in another few weeks with a more detailed plan. That's all I have.
Thanks, Mark. Ron?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a few things. Went to Cameron's State of the City address, which was well done, and it was a great evening, and it was a very good presentation. Also went to the reopening of the Adult Community Center after the recent remodel, and it looks beautiful. I'll be even more excited to see it when it gets furniture in it, but I guess that's on its way. Anyway, it was a great crowd, and it was nice to see everybody there. And I don't have, I'm just looking to see if there's anything, a couple things. We had a San Mateo County Affordable Housing and Jobs Task Force meeting last week. It's a monthly task force that meets all the elected, not all the elected, but elected official representatives of all the cities in San Mateo County, plus a lot of housing organizations trying to figure out ways to solve our housing crisis. We had another meeting. I think we're finally making some real progress because we're getting a lot of interesting ideas about some of the availability of not only land but financial resources and partners that can participate in solving the problem, because it really is a problem that affects everybody, whether you own a house or you rent or you have kids or whatever. It does affect everybody in one way or another. Also, last Thursday night, went to a Caltrain meeting. Dan Richard, who is the chairman of the California High-Speed Rail, gave us an update. There is about $2.9 billion that is dedicated. The project is under construction. We can't see it, obviously, because all the infrastructure is being built down by Merced, I believe, and they have made a decision that their first leg is going to be basically, I believe, from Bakersfield to San Jose, and I'm looking at Jay Walter because he was there as well, and he can correct me if I missed anything. But that is progressing. It is a huge project. Probably by the time it's in service, I'll probably be dead, but it's probably about 15 years away. But electrification is on track, no pun intended, and that should be ready to roll about 2020 or 2021. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Ron. Matt?
Well, I don't have anything that's really council related, but I did want to, being that it's my first night back since I finished up my treatment, I just wanted to thank folks for all their support. There was an article in the paper a while ago that said Grocott beats cancer, and I just wanted to make a correction on that because nobody beats cancer, number one. You live with cancer after you've had it. And number two, Grocott didn't beat cancer because nobody beats cancer alone. And having said that, I just want to thank the community. There's so many great people in this town who came forward and helped out our family with trips to the hospital, meals, helping take care of my son who was doing travel hockey and getting to his games and practices and so forth. And then people coming and visiting me when I was in the hospital for stem cell, which is a pretty big ordeal in and of itself, about 25 days of isolation. So it's not done alone, and again, we have a great community here with a lot of great people. I also want to mention just the prayer support I got and the emails, messages I got were, that's the kind of thing that really uplifts your spirits, keeps you going. So both folks on staff here at the city and just the residents of this town, I thank everybody for their support.
That's
I'd
great
like to say
hear.
welcome back, Matt.
Yeah.
Good to see you back.
Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. From the balanced side of the dais now.
Mark's not noticing.
From the balanced side of the dais now.
The dais was on balance.
I know that. I thought you were looking at me when you said that, so that's all right. I'll just keep slinging them out there. Something's going to stick. I guess, Ron indicated the events in the state of the city, which was, again, we're well done, and the opening of the adult community center, which was great. Christine Boland had a big smile on her face, as did Jay. It's almost there, except for the punch list, I'm sure. But anyway. I went to a finance committee meeting today of commute.org, which is an organization that tries to get people to commute. And so I'm going to steal this from you, Mark, even though you're going to get this next week. We have a commuter challenge. 2016 commuter challenge runs from April 1st to May 31st. And basically it's a contest for individuals and for companies. And there's all kinds of great prizes. You get weekly prizes and grand prizes, gift cards and Fitbits and computers and all kinds of stuff. Trying to encourage people to carpool, shuttle, take public transportation. And if you need to get more information about this, it's commute.org. And it's really important because I don't know about yourself, but when I drive on the road, there's an awful lot of folks that are, not saying I'm not one of them, driving by themselves. And I think all of us need to try to figure out a way to sort of buddy up somewhere along the line. I think that's all I have, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Bob. And for me, I brought a few pictures from the past couple weeks to share. So, as my colleagues mentioned, we did the State of the City last week. It was, I really enjoyed the event. I'm glad we had so many people come out, and I wanted to thank the Chamber of Commerce for organizing it. I know it's going to be broadcast on Channel 27, is that right, Jeff? As well as I think a YouTube link has been posted. But I would be definitely interested in any feedback and an opportunity to continue the conversation about what's going on with our city this year. I had an opportunity to do 2 repeat performances last week, one for the Rotary Club and one for the folks at the Elms, both on Friday. Let's see here. Here's my show and tell from the ACC opening. It's a beautiful facility. It looks great. Thanks to Christine and Jay and everyone. You guys did a great job. It was a wonderful event, a great turnout. That same day, I had an opportunity to host a couple groups on the opposite end of the age spectrum, 2 kindergarten classes from Arundel, Mrs. Brown's class and Mrs. Selby's class. There was about 50 kids in total in attendance doing a rapid-fire town hall. They definitely kept me on my toes. And then last week, I got to had the opportunity to participate in an event with Peninsula Volunteers to do their Meals on Wheels program every year. They have all the mayors from the county. I think most of my colleagues have done this in the past. And so I got to go out with Linda Drew, who's a prominent volunteer in town, and we delivered to a number of seniors in San Carlos, including this woman who had an amazing story. She's lived in San Carlos her entire life. She's 97 years old. She was the original owner of her house. She's owned this house for 70 years, since 1946. and she's totally sharp and in great shape. So I really got a lot out of it. Peninsula Volunteers delivers over 70,000 meals per year to folks in the county who are either isolated, lower income, need help with a meal. So it's a great organization, and I was happy to support them. I also attended the kickoff, the very first meeting of the JPA for Peninsula Clean Energy. We had a really good turnout. We're going to be meeting twice a month, so Ron, you are my alternate, so that you're on notice, because they're on a very aggressive timeline, and they have a twice a month meeting schedule, so I may need to call you into action. But the big step is we have to submit an implementation plan to the California Public Utilities Commission. There was a lot of discussion about that, and there's a lot of discussion in general about what electricity products the JPA should offer to ratepayers. It's likely that one will be about 50% renewable and 50% fossil fuel based, and it will cost about or slightly below what people pay for PG&E, and there will be another option for 100% renewable, which will cost obviously a bit more. So more to come on that. Lastly, I just put this in here to remind myself that Congresswoman Jackie Spears' office has reached out to me. They're putting together a committee to give feedback to the Federal Aviation Administration. Specifically, they're reaching out because they're putting together something called the Select Committee on South Bay Arrivals, which is about, I believe there's been a lot of concerns from residents, not so many that I've heard in San Carlos, but I have heard in the news about flight plans coming up from the South Bay and landing at SFO. So Congresswoman Jackie Spear, Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, and Congressman Sam Farr are each pulling 4 committee members and 4 alternates. So they would like someone from San Carlos to be an alternate, which I think means probably the responsibilities will be somewhat light, and it's an opportunity to participate in conversation, give feedback to the FAA. So I was wondering if anyone would be willing to volunteer.
I'll volunteer.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bob. So I'll let the Congresswoman's staff know. And that is all I have.
I had one more thing.
Okay, great. Ron, one more thing?
Yeah, I forgot to mention that last Friday, Bob and I attended the Star Vista Starting Line Breakfast, which is an organization that started out as Youth and Family Enrichment Services, and then they changed their name along the way, and then eventually changed it to Star Vista. But this is an organization that provides mental health and emotional support to families and to young people having a difficult time with their circumstances and surroundings. And we heard a couple of great heartwarming stories, and it's a great organization. It's called Star Vista. I encourage you to go online. You can donate to it, but it's an organization that has just been working quietly for the last, I think, about 30 years to serve families and youth in San Mateo County.
Great. Thank you, Ron. All right. Staff comments on administrative business. Mr. Maltby.
Just one quick one. As the council's aware, we've had 2 strategic planning sessions with your group. The staff's going to be meeting this week to continue the process in developing work objectives and a work plan to begin implementing the council's plan. So you'll see that again as we bring it back to you in about a month.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. All right. Item 5 is public comment for items not on the agenda. I do not have any speaker cards for items not on the agenda. Is there anyone who wishes to speak tonight? Okay. Seeing none, we will move on to approval of the consent calendar. Consent items are considered to be routine and will be enacted by one motion. There's no separate discussion on these items unless members of the council, staff, or public request specific items to be removed for separate action. Is there anyone who would like to pull any items from the consent calendar? If not, I will entertain a motion.
Mr. Mayor, I'll move that we approve consent calendar items A through N.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Crystal, please call the roll.
Councilmember Collins?
Yes.
Councilmember Grisilli?
Yes.
Councilmember Grocott?
Yes.
Councilmember Obert?
Yes.
Mayor Johnson?
Yes. All right, we will move on to item 7, reports to council. 7A, report on update on North Crestview Park master planning process. Ms. Boland. Oh, here you go. Unless you want to do it. All yours.
Evening, Mayor, members of the City Council. Welcome back, Councilmember Grocott. Nice to see you. We missed you. Christine Boland, Parks and Recreation Director. Before we launch into this presentation this evening, I thought I would give you a quick glimpse of the work that was done up at North Crestview Park by the Army Corps of Engineers. They just concluded last week the investigation of the underground tanks, which they found nothing, and they retrofitted the property back to its original condition. So the slide you see here is the result of the hydro seeding that was done. So I just wanted to mention that before we get into the agenda item this evening.
They didn't find any tanks?
They did not find any tanks.
Okay, thank you.
No, just a little bit of random sewer pipe. Water pipe, excuse me. This evening, I'd like to report on have our consultant come up. Mark Slichter is here with Calendar Associates. He is going to walk you through the public meeting that we had in January on the master planning of North Crestview Park. So, Mark, here's your presentation.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you, council members, for giving me the opportunity this evening to make this presentation. I'm going to try to keep it short and just basically kind of catch you up on where we are with the project. We got started the end of the year, and as Christine mentioned, we've had a public meeting. I did want to quickly run through, kind of give everybody an orientation to the site. But basically what we were charged with doing is evaluating the potential of the site to better address the community needs. And so what we've done is become familiar with the site. We have an environmental consultant helping us. They're putting together a CEQA checklist. They have not completed their work yet, but that's pending. The North Crestview site is 4 acres in size. So as a point of reference, Crestview is essentially the same size, to give you some sense of scale. However, Crestview has more flat area than North Crestview does. So there's the site. This is a parcel that, as I understand it, was at one time contemplated to be accessed to 280, and thankfully that never went anywhere. But what you see at the top of that image is the old Vista, the old rest area off of 280. That's actually closed and can't be accessed at this time. So the Crestview Park site's bounded in the white there. We have neighbors on both sides. Crestview Drive to the bottom of the image to the east there. And what doesn't jump out at you by looking at a photo is the topography of the site. There's a fair amount of grade change. There's about 50 feet of elevation that you pick up from Crestview Drive to the back of the site. And most of that you pick up in about the first third of the site, so maybe 30 feet or so. It's pretty steep right off the street there. So I'll run you through some quick images, and then I'll share with you what was brought to our public meeting. So there's the view from the street. This is looking towards the south end, and you can see a couple things jump out at you there, the proximity of the homes and then the steepness of the grade. The north edge is, again, this is a residential edge. What's interesting here is that the homes on the north side are substantially lower than the elevation of the park, so it feels much more separated from the park than the homes on the south side. Some of the, there's not much in the way of it's a fantastic site. Let me just say that for starters. So don't take my comments the wrong way. But there's not much there now in the way of man-made improvements. There's a lot there in the way of just natural assets. But in terms of what we do find, there are a lot of trails that have developed over time, and some that appear to be kind of remnant access like this one here. There are drainage channels on the north and the south side of the park, kind of towards the top of the slope, and I would venture that those were put in to keep the water on the site from shooting down onto the street. So now I'm going to jump into the images that we shared with the public in our meeting. That was on the 21st of January. And we call these inspiration images because we're looking for inspiration in terms of the sorts of improvements, sorts of accommodations that we might make here. So the notion here is that we would add some shade and some seating, a gathering area. All of these, none of these should be taken literally. So, the notion is that we'd put a shade structure out there. Would it be exactly this type, size, scale? No, probably not. But it's an inspiration image. Group seating areas, and even the potential for barbecue. And I'll get through these, and then I'll share with you some of the input that we got in that meeting. Exercise equipment would be a relatively easy thing to accommodate. And then gathering areas that could take a more organic form that might respond more to the site in terms of the use of the materials. Trails, it's already got some of that. We can simply improve on those a little bit. The notion of a portion of the site potentially used as a dog park area, and a little bit of the site's pretty steeply sloping. It's very naturalized, if you will. So it doesn't appear to be a candidate for intensive development, but moderate development was an idea that we wanted to explore here. We could take some portion of the area and not put an athletic field in per se, but put in an area of turf that could be used on a very informal basis. And then play areas, some sort of an opportunity like that, possibility of restrooms, and then something like something that would attract wildlife, butterflies, bees, that sort of thing. And then just very casual uses like this. You're right there on the top of the ridge. So a day like today, you'd have a hard time keeping that kite in your hands, I think. But on a normal day, it could be kind of a nice place for an activity like this. So these are the images that we shared. And then what I want to do now is I'm not going to be able to give you all the input that we got, but I'm going to try to do a little bit of just a recap. And then after that, I'm going to share with you where we've gone with it as a result of the input that we received. There was a lot of interest in essentially leaving it as it is. There was a lot of neighbors who felt that it had a lot of value in its current state. There was a suggestion that we preserve the wildlife migration, so there's observations of wildlife moving through that area. And then we preserve the flora and fauna of the site. Among the ideas that we had some receptiveness to included, and I think this originated with some of the people in the audience, a memorial. The site was, during World War II, it was a war dog training facility. And there was some interest expressed in memorializing that prior use of the site. There was a receptiveness in general to uses that would not be noise generators. There was some receptiveness to improving the access to the site, improving the trails on the site, and then simple improvements like the addition of seating, so that when you're out there, you've got a place to take a break as you're strolling around. So now I'm going to go into where we've gone since then, and that would be this concept here. So I can walk you through this pretty quickly. What should jump out at you right away is that the majority of the site is essentially left in its natural state, and we're proposing some relatively modest improvements here. So I'll start with the blue diagonal coming up off of Crestview Drive, that dashed line. That follows an existing remnant road alignment. The notion there is that that could be graded out a little bit, and that could be rocked. So as opposed to asphalt, but a rock type road based material could be put down. And the idea is that that would allow access if needed by emergency vehicles. There's no access up there now, and that's been kind of a source of concern for us since the beginning. So that would be the most kind of intuitive way to accommodate that. Then you've got that sort of big magenta S on the left-hand side, and that is an accessible path of travel up above to get up the gradient and to get to where you have these tremendous overviews of the bay, sweeping views. And so I'll show you images of the kind of thing that we're thinking about what does that mean? What does that magenta dash line mean? I'll show you an image in just a second here. It starts where it does because we're just a little bit higher on Crestview Drive, so we've got just a little bit less gradient to try to accommodate. And it terminates at the Memorial Overlook, so we're running with the idea of a war dog memorial, and that's a potential location for it right there. So from there, I'm going to go to the dashed gold lines, the thinner one, and that's a single track trail. So that's just basically a walking trail all through there. And it follows areas where existing trails are. There's one place where in the top right corner where you see a blue piece. That's basically just connecting existing sections of trail. And then the red stars are seating areas, just trying to spread those out kind of uniformly to give people a place to relax. And then the big green above the Memorial Overlook is meadow, and that's would allow for casual uses like picnicking, that kind of thing. We're not thinking about, at this point in time, we're not thinking about mass grading or that kind of thing, but simply it may be something as simple as just mowing that so it is more useful to visitors. And then up there in the blue circle within the green circle, the picnic area, would be a gathering space in addition to the Memorial Outlook as a gathering space. So let me run through some quick images here of what's in our heads here. So this is the access road, something along these lines, just a simple graded out and rocked path, but it would be enough to get a vehicle up there. The accessible trail is something along these lines. This is out. Some of you may recognize this. This is Edgewood Park. And single track. This is something like these where it's just a maintained walking tread. This is out there at Windy Hill. And then in terms of the Memorial Overlook, a couple of nice precedents have recently come online, and so we wanted to share those images with you. This is one of them. This is the Audrey Rust Memorial at Ancient Oaks Open Space, just on the west side of 35 and just down Alpine a little way. And another kind of inspiration image. This is in that same location. It was just down the slope from the one I showed you just before it. Here's one way to go with a memorial for the war dogs. We'd have to do a lot of homework there to get all of our facts and make sure that whatever shows up on site is reflective of that use of the site. This is just a file image. Other uses on the site, as opposed to a dog park, simply taking dogs on leashed walks is certainly a opportunity there, and it's a use that we understand is happening today. And then, the kind of the no-brainer, if you will, is given what we have going on there, there's great opportunities simply to just take it in and enjoy it and do nature viewing. So that concludes what I've got in the way of a presentation here this evening, and I'm happy to respond to any questions. You guys let me know what I can do to facilitate.
Great, thank you. Remind me your name again, sir?
I'm sorry, it's Mark Slichter, and I'm with Calendar Associates.
Questions for Mr. Slichter? Mark?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Mark. Good presentation. I think actually the two questions I have to start with are for staff. So, Christine, can you walk me through what the outreach process to the community involved, and in particular, given the size of this park, what steps were taken to engage voices throughout the community as opposed to the folks who live next door?
In addition to the next door notification, which was about a 500 to 1,000 foot radius, we did do social media and other public notices, electronic, and the direct mail, direct notification to the neighborhood.
Why did we choose not to go more broadly with the outreach to the community to let them know that we were developing, conceptual plans and ideas for the park? I mean, this is basically one of the largest potential parks in San Carlos. And given that, to me, it's if it were to become a park, it's much more of a community park as opposed to a neighborhood park. There's quite a few neighborhood parks that we have in various places. So I'd expect that there'd be potential interest in the community-wide weighing in, from people who don't necessarily live within 1,000 feet.
I'm going to answer that. I believe we did do the same type of wide outreach that we would do for any community event. Can we get somebody to work on these mics? Because they're still way too hot.
I like hearing your voice resonate.
Yeah.
Oh, we heard it twice.
It's great, isn't it? So I think we used we sent out thousands of electronic notifications through all the e-notify system and whatnot that we normally did. We don't typically do a community-wide postcard mailing for projects like this, just because it becomes very cost prohibitive to do so. But we expanded the neighborhood outreach that we did, given the fact that this was a very new project.
Oh, good, because that was not clear to me. Thank you, Jeff.
I'm sorry, we also did get it into the Good Living newsletter, which was on the left of an upcoming notification, an upcoming public meeting. So that was going directly to 12,000 neighbors. And
of the folks either in meetings or that you heard from and interacted with, what's the breakdown between, say, folks who live within 500 feet of the place and folks who live outside of that?
I would say primarily the response was directly from the neighboring,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Last question I have for now is just can you refresh my memory, Christine, of in your role as Parks and Rec Director, you obviously get lambasted all the time by people asking for this and that and the other thing in terms of resources. In terms of park type or resources that could be met with parks, what types of things do you typically, what are the pressure points that you're experiencing today?
Well, lack of funding. You mean?
Sorry, I meant in terms of specific resources. Like you and I have talked offline about there's always a perennial issue about, for example, soccer. We never seem to have enough soccer fields. Okay, so what other things like that? Tennis courts, basketball courts. What do you hear about?
Primarily fields, playing fields. At Burton, there's not enough basketball courts, of course. Gathering places, just somewhere to sit down, benches, those types of places in an open space. Dogs, yes, of course. Space for dogs.
Okay. And specifically, actually, because I remember a couple of years ago, it seemed like I at least was, I think we all were the focus of quite a bit of effort from various tennis organizations to boost the amount of tennis capacity there was in town. Is that an issue anymore? Or? I haven't heard from them in a while.
I haven't heard from them in a couple years, and I think because we have Highlands and because we have Burton, there's also Arundel courts. I think we're okay with courts in general.
Okay, good, thank you.
Other questions? Matt?
Yeah. Good presentation, and for me, I like the direction it appears the park's going. But I just had a couple of questions. Given the adjacency to the closed lookout off of 280, is there any outreach to, I guess it would be, Caltrans, on what their intent is long-term with the outlook? Are they planning to just leave it closed? Is it something that's going to become available? Do we know? Haven't asked them?
Asked them, but I believe it's going, there was no plans, and I thought it was going to be closed forever due to
Indefinitely.
the... Indefinitely, yeah.
I just bring it up because if it were something that, again, had accessibility, it might affect the park if it were going to be used as a lookout again. And number two, if it never is there any interest in, it might present to us an opportunity to even expand something that is could become a great park, especially for the way it appears it's going with trails and that sort of thing. And I know there's been interest in the past. I know Greg looked at it of trails that would hook up from the north end now of Pulcus Ridge, and then carrying on through the watershed area over to the cross-country course, right? And so there might be some availability to connect with that as well. And so I just put that out as a comment, something that staff might want to look into. Second question, looking at accessibility, I didn't see any direct accessibility either from the north or the south from the two multifamily complexes that exist there already. Is there any indication from those folks that they want that or don't want that, or any interest there to be able to, in other words, walk out your back door and have access to a trail?
I don't recall a specific interest by the immediate neighbors to have that kind of access.
Okay. And then the last question I had it sort of builds upon what Mr. Olbert was hinting at, I think, anyways, is if there was community interest and suddenly we're talking about putting in tennis courts or a basketball court or whatever. Two things on that: the feasibility of those kind of facilities given the gradient, and it seems to me if you don't hit a tennis ball right, it's going to end up in some gully somewhere. So that aspect of it, with your experience, designing parks, and then number two. Probably not prepared to answer this all together, but just the ballpark figure of trying to put in facilities like that are obviously flat in an area that's obviously, got quite a bit of gradient to it.
Speaking to the first one, in terms of what could kind of fit, is that the essence of the question?
Yeah, just I guess the suitability of putting in, any kind of court that involves a ball on a site like that, where if you misdirect it or hit it wrong or whatever, it ends up in the wildlife. I don't know.
One of the first things we did when we started looking at it is take out some templates of different fields and kind of lay them out there, and the site starts getting pretty small pretty fast. So I mentioned Crestview Park as being essentially the same size, but if you think about Crestview Park is the field, and then there's uses around it, but the field is the dominant element. So to put something of that scale here, that would be kind of the resultant, except that it'd be a little bit more of a shoehorning exercise, because so much of this site has substantial slope towards the street frontage that you have less workable real estate to start with. So something like that I just don't see it. Could you put something smaller in there? You could. Basketball courts are a lot smaller than soccer fields. That kind of a thing would fit more easily. Then the question becomes, is that the right kind of thing to happen here? And that's something that comes out of the dialogue that we're having now. In terms of the cost to do it, if we were to put substantial improvements in, what we shared with you in the way of a concept, the notion is primarily passive uses, and the notion is that people accessing the site are either from the neighborhood, or if you drive to the site, there's a lot of street frontage, and it's a very wide street. So first pass, it looks like we could probably accommodate people on the street if we had passive uses. I can't foresee a scenario where passive uses of this site would cause a saturation of parking on Crestview. If we get into more intensive uses, then we'd need to look at off-street parking. So then we're looking at the potential of constructing an access road up onto the site and then building a small parking lot on the site, something maybe along the lines, again, of what you see at Crestview. So that adds, that's a substantial add in cost. I'm reluctant to stand up here right now and throw numbers at it. Sure. But those are some of my thoughts with respect to those kinds of improvements at the site.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Ron?
Yeah, I just had a question for Christine. When we were considering the relocation of the dog park, we did a fair amount of outreach, but when it was all said and done, the interesting thing is that we got criticism from the people who live across the street saying that they didn't know about it. And it seems to me that this is sort of the opposite situation. We had lots of notice to the neighbors, and that I went to that January 21st meeting, and it was very well attended by the residents who live very close by, who have, very good and certain ideas about what ought to be the best use of that property. But I'm wondering, and I'm just wondering out loud, and I don't know if there's any support among my colleagues as to whether or not we should do a broader outreach. I mean, Mark mentioned that, it's a big piece of land. It's 4 or 5 acres. And I'm wondering if maybe we ought to reach out to the broader community and get their input as to what they might want to see, because it is a community asset. It is its sheer size does lend it, more in favor of a community park rather than a neighborhood park. So I'm just wondering if that's something that we might want to incorporate down the road.
We're planning on going back to the Park and Recreation Commission, and I believe we have one more public meeting, and then back to council for consideration of the final plan. So we do have a few more cracks at it to open it up to the community in general.
Oh, good. I don't want to be accused of not being inclusive of our residents. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Ron. Mark, did you have another question?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Just a follow on, a couple actually. Has anybody else on the council walked this park? Okay, so we have, because I have as well. I'm glad to see most of us have. When I walked it the first couple of times, one of the things that impressed me was that it certainly has a fairly steep grade, but actually, as you mentioned early on in your comments, the vast majority of that's actually in the first third of the property. Once you get up, so when you're on the street and you look up, you're like, wow, this must be Everest. But it's not. Once you get up there, there's actually a relatively shallow grade for quite a bit of the park. Which leads into my question, which is that I'd really like to see when this gets brought back that we really have looked carefully at the cost versus size trade-off of different kinds of fields. I'm not opposed at all to the idea of having the type of park that you outline, but when we talk to folks in the community, one of the things that comes up all the time is that whether it's basketball courts or soccer fields or whatever, we don't really have enough fields. What we do have, if not in the town itself, right nearby, we do have a large number of acres that are, let me describe them as hiking places. Pulgus Ridge,
Big Canyon, Eden
Right,
Park.
exactly. There's quite a bit. What we don't have a lot of is the other kinds of parks, okay? Personally, I think that if you were to come back and say, well, we could put a soccer field up there, but it would cost them $1 million, I wouldn't be surprised to hear that. But there are other kinds of fields, okay? There are other kinds of sports. You mentioned some of them that I'd like to make sure we look at very carefully.
Thanks, Mark. The question I wanted to ask is, so Vista Park is right across the street, and so how do you think about whether those two facilities should be integrated, thematically or from a usage perspective, or should they be similar? I mean, today Vista Park has seating areas and I think it has barbecue areas. Is that right? Maybe not.
No, it
Okay,
doesn't.
no barbecue area.
No.
Sorry, but are they different parks? Are they the same park? How should we think about them? How should we, provide information to the community about them?
Well, as it stands currently, Vista is a pull up at the curb. You can walk your dog through it. You can sit down, look at the San Francisco view. As North Crestview sits, it's up a steep hill, and then it levels out. So essentially, it could be a duplicate of Vista, but there's a track up there, not accessible until we make such improvements. But and it's also much bigger. So I don't know if I'm getting at your question, but
I guess another question is, did we think about it or talk about those two facilities since they're right across the street from each other? I imagine that people who go to Crestview Park are going to park at Vista because there is that kind of curb cut there. And I don't know, was that part of any of the conversation or feedback that you got? Or
we didn't combine the two at all.
Okay.
No.
And do you have any sense of, Vista, is it a successful park? Is it fulfilling? How do we think about it? Does it serve the needs that it's been set up to do? Because I think I personally, I'll just say, that I like the direction, and I particularly like the idea of the, small gathering areas, seated areas, using natural materials, making it feel integrated into the site. But I think there's potentially an opportunity with a facility right across the street to have some kind of tie-in or something. So, but it sounds like that has yet to be part of the conversation.
No.
I guess I would ask that, as you're talking about it with the Park and Rec Commission and other things you think about, does it make sense to have two facilities doing the same thing across from each other? And should it all be named the same thing? Et cetera. So. And then, so Christine, tonight, are you looking for any specific direction, comments, or is this just a report and you're going to?
This was a pit stop just to get any council commentary, or if you had any ideas of your own for the park. Otherwise, we'll move on to Park and Recreation Commission, another public meeting, and then back to you with the final. So this is your opportunity to chime in.
Okay. Well, I know we have a number of folks from the public here, and I do have some speaker cards. So how about, if it's all right with everyone, we'll take public comment, and then if there's any final comments to wrap up. So I have 3 public comment cards. If anyone else would like to speak on public comment, there's slips in the back, and we'll start with James Auer. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, Council, and administration, and community. I'd like to just make 2 comments. First of all, thank you for the due diligence that the Parks Commission and the Parks Department is doing, as well as the consultant, to find out what really would work in that space. I am a neighbor at the park on the north side, and would ask that the community that's been reached out to also be fully informed about the space being what it is, and some of the elements in that space that aren't necessarily addressed up front right now would have to do with the extreme fire hazard that is the space, with the extreme wildlife that is there, and the different risks that we have to the community by putting extra people up there without the monitoring and with the privacy that's up there and the things that go on. The property is bounded by two fatal attractions. There was a wreck right on one corner on the north side where a kid lost his life and a pole fell over on him and killed him. And then on the back side where that turnaround and that access is closed off, there was a murder. And so it does have some karma there that may not bode well for a bunch of other people collecting up there. But I would just ask that we continue to be sensitive to the neighbors that have invested in that property area, as they are as much owners and proud to make it a good part of the community as everybody else. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Our next speaker is Julia Mensing.
Thank you, Mayor, council members, and administration. I live actually right next door to Jim. I've lived up there for almost 30 years, and this land has been undeveloped and unattended for quite a long time. All of a sudden, it's getting all this attention, and I think that's lovely, but I think I'd like to echo what Jim said. I have lived up there and witnessed the young man that lost his life when the light pole fell over, the light pole, by the way, that's yet to be replaced. I've also witnessed other things like kids coming up there and doing all kinds of things. There's been drug paraphernalia and everything you can possibly imagine found in that park. It does lend itself to the ability to look out and see such a lovely area, but it also lends itself to problems. There's a lot of kids with the police not coming by there as much as they used to. There's a lot of problems up there with teenagers, and it's a little disconcerting, especially with the robberies in the area, which have happened regularly. I also own dogs, and I know there's been a lot of talk about dog parks, but there's plenty of dog parks in San Carlos, and I really don't think a dog park is the way to go. I don't walk my dogs up there because of the snakes, because of the wildlife, and because of the ticks. And it's also, just so you know, it is a gateway for the wild animals. I have come across mountain lions. I have crossed paths with coyotes. It is a gateway for them. It is a place for them to come from the watershed. And if we take too much away from them, there's nothing left for them. And I get you want to develop it, but I also would encourage you to consider leaving it as natural as possible. We do have to have some places that we don't develop the life out of. We have to have some places that we leave alone and allow nature to just be what it is. And I appreciate your time and consideration, and thank you for hearing what I have to say.
Thank you. And the last speaker card I have is Judith Selvage. Good evening.
Good evening. It's interesting to hear the things that have been proposed. I echo the last speaker's idea that it would be nice to keep it the serene, open, and undeveloped space that it is. And I'm here representing some of the wildlife to let you know that within the last 3 months I've encountered 2 rattlesnakes, one just a few weeks ago up there at the end of February, and then further in the space where the townhouses are, but right against the fence which separates the open space from the developed areas, another rattlesnake. So they're not all hibernating now. They're still out there. I've also found in walking up there, I've met some residents from many years ago who used to play up there, and was informed by one of them that they couldn't play baseball up there because of the winds. It is a very windy site. So keep that in mind if you're thinking of tennis courts or baseball or whatever. And finally, the amount of wildlife is really something that would be nice to preserve. It's an extremely serene site. When you allow for the slope, it's not 4 acres anymore. It's about 2.5 to consider developing. I like the idea of the statue, and it would be nice if it could be seen from the street, so close enough to the edge of that slope. Right now, and to get back to the point someone was asking about Vista Park. Vista Park is being used by dog walkers and by passers-by. We get probably the people that I see using Vista Park, I would say 90% are neighbors who have come on foot, and 10% might be people who are driving and getting out with their pets and walking there. But they're not people who are going to be climbing the equivalent of a 5-story building to go up and take their pets on North Crestview Park. So, thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would wish to speak? Yeah, please come on up. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you, Mayor. Welcome back, Matt. First of all, thank you, Christine and Mark from the consulting company. The meeting was very, very well attended, and there was a large number of people who came to a consensus very quickly. The direction that I think you're taking it is in definite accordance with what people had asked, which was, let's keep it as beautifully natural as we can while enhancing it and making it more accessible and more aware to other people in San Carlos. Just in the last year, and it may have been since the whole school conflict on that property, there have been a lot more people up there. I think that's why the trails are much more ground in. I know I worked with the Army Corps, their consultant, and Christine in the city, and Jay, to preserve the 14 San Francisco wood rat nests that were identified on the property, which is a staggering number for the area. But in terms of how we could enhance this property for use by other people, I could enlist people, train them on how to be docents and do docent-led tours up there. There are a staggering number of opportunities of what to share in terms of the wildlife, in terms of the geology. I mean, you can see, maybe not in this shot, but there's Mount Diablo you can see, and the whole chain of volcanoes up and down California. There's a lot of learning and education that can be done up there that doesn't require bathrooms or water or electricity. And just like Crestview Park, one could do astronomy things up there as well. Lastly, just to differentiate between Vista Park and North Crestview, if I can just have a couple more seconds.
Please do.
Vista Park was a graded area between the complexes that were being built, and nothing was being done with that. Some neighbors and some volunteer agencies got together with the city and said, look, if we put our effort and our labor and our money in there, would you support maintaining it? That's what it was. It was a groundswell activity to create paths, to plant native flora, largely which didn't take. This is an area, because of the excruciating wind and elements, it doesn't lend itself to doing man-made plantings. It just doesn't. That was one of the reasons we worked very, very hard to work with the Army Corps to try and replace what would be there before natural things started to take over. So I just wanted to pass that along, that they're very different. One has been manicured and it's doing what it's doing not so well, and right now North Crestview is doing beautifully, and the wildflowers that are growing up there right against the watershed are spectacular. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak this evening? Please come on up. If you could introduce yourself and fill out a speaker card afterwards.
Good evening. I'm Charlene Edinburgh. I'm a native of San Carlos, and I've spoken before you before. Welcome back, sir. I appreciate that the consultant has quite nicely summarized the result of the meeting. I'm curious why the council member wonders why it would be attended by neighbors. We have no easements next to this park. There are no boundaries. People that come up in this park are right in our front yards and backyards. That's the same problem that we have with people who trespass in the open space behind in the San Francisco Water District area. And so we call police when we see that people are trudging around up there because they put a hole in the fence, and apparently the idea of putting a hole in the fence doesn't compute with trespass. So if anybody were going to pursue connecting up all the trails with the Mid-Peninsula open space folks, there was one person who attended our meeting in January who said, oh boy, here's the opportunity to connect everything up. I think that the idea of moving any access and trail connection away from the property would be great, because we don't have backyards and we don't have fence lines in the same way that people with houses have. So I just wanted to make that point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Is there anyone else who would like to speak tonight? Okay, well, we can wrap up with any direction from, or any final comments from the dais. And Mark, you want to start?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just want to say that as this process goes forward, I think it's been a bunch of great work that's been done so far, and I want to encourage staff and our consultants as they come up with plans to bring back to us, that we not be overly influenced or even influenced at all by fear. These types of changes always induce fear amongst certain elements of the community, whether it's people walking through an area that didn't get walked through before or what have you. The reality is that when you're part of a community, those things are not necessarily desirable, but they are part of being part of a community. And if we were to use those same fear element pieces of logic, we could argue ourselves into closing down every public park in San Carlos, which we clearly wouldn't want to do, because we clearly have a net benefit overall from this. So don't be overly influenced by fear, and please do focus on coming up with ideas that will meet overall community needs, whatever those are, whether it's fields, as I was talking about, basketball courts, or I like the idea of picnic areas because there's some beautiful vistas up there. But whatever we do, let's please make sure we focus on overall community needs and interests.
Thank you, Mark. Ron?
Yeah, my only comment is I just thank you for the presentation. I think it was well done, and I just am excited to see the process go forward, and the more outreach we get, the better. So thanks.
Thanks, Ron. Bob?
I just wanted to mention that I want to make sure that we get all the, and you already have, I think, a lot of input from obviously the neighbors as well as other members of the community. It is I don't agree necessarily with everything some of my colleagues say, but it is a public resource and it's a fairly large piece of property, and I don't want to leave anything on the table, or should I say off the table, that people would talk about. Having said that, I think the topography makes it difficult to do certain things, but I think it lends itself to certain other areas. I just don't want to leave anything off. And appreciate the information. Again, with the outreach, I think that's super important. And there'll be 2 more meetings, the public meeting and then the Park and Rec, and it'll come back to us, I think you said. So I think hopefully that'll be enough time. Are we talking about a 6-month period now, or what are we talking about?
Yeah, roughly
Under 6 months? Okay, all right. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Bob. Matt, did you have any final comments? Well, I'll just close by, I want to thank the folks who came out and everyone who participated in the public meeting. I'm personally attracted to the direction. I think, as Bob said, the topography lends itself to, more of a natural setting. I've been up there, it's a place with scenic views, it's a place for contemplation, it's a place to connect with nature. So I think that the designs have been fitting thus far. I'd be interested to see what more public comment there can be. I think given that we're potentially talking about a relatively low resource commitment compared to other facilities, I think there's a potential to use potentially some really nice materials and do things that might add some kind of unique flavor, so it doesn't just feel like we're sticking, a bench that feels out of place up there. So I liked the concept with, the seated stone, or doesn't have to be that, but I just think that there's an opportunity to do something a little bit unique. So anyway, I appreciate everyone participating and look forward to the next steps. And with that, we'll move on to item 7B, a report to council on the results of the community satisfaction survey conducted by True North Research. Ms. Peterson.
Hello. Good evening, Council. My name is Tara Peterson, Assistant City Manager, and before you this evening for your review is the Community Satisfaction Survey that was recently undertaken by True North Research. This evening we have Dr. Tim McClarney, who will be presenting the results of that survey.
Thank you, Tara. Good evening, Mayor and members of Council. I'm Tim McClarney. I'm the president of True North Research, and we're a firm that for the past 15 years has specialized in working with cities throughout the state in using surveys like this to develop a statistically reliable understanding of the communities that they serve. To date, my business partner and I have worked on over 900 research studies for public agencies, and about a third of those, around 300, were for California cities. Many of those studies were similar to the type of study that we're going to be talking about here tonight. And as a measure of full disclosure, I also have had the opportunity to work with the city on past resident surveys, and you'll see that in tonight's presentation, which will cover the highlights of what we have in that full report. There's several slides in here that will show how the results from 2016 compare to the last cycle, which was back in 2014. As I go through tonight's presentation, I welcome questions from council as I go or at the end, whichever is your preference. Okay, so before we talk about the results, it's helpful to take a moment to quickly review the purpose of the study, or the why we do this type of research, as well as the how of the study, or the methodology. In terms of the purpose, there's about 6 bullets shown here, but in the interest of time, these sort of roll up conceptually to, on the one hand, these are what I would call a needs assessment tool. That is, getting a good handle on what the needs and priorities and preferences of your residents are with respect to the services and facilities and policies you provide as a city. Once you've sort of tackled that side of the coin, the other side of the coin is a performance measurement tool. So how satisfied are residents with the city's performance in providing municipal services overall, as well as in a variety of specific service areas and facilities. And then lastly, it's an opportunity to dig in deeper in certain topic areas of interest to the city at this time, as well as over time. Things like parks and recreation, traffic circulation, public safety, redevelopment and planning, et cetera. And so we're going to touch on a number of these in tonight's presentation, but there are more graphics, more slides, more questions in the full report that we won't cover in tonight's presentation. So if you're interested in digging deeper, you'll find that information there. In terms of the methodology, or how we went about conducting this study, this was a survey of San Carlos households. In the past, we used to use telephone only, both for sampling. You'd randomize telephone numbers in the city, as well as for data collection. Over time, as people have migrated away from landlines towards cell phones, as caller ID has grown, as people have gotten used to working online, we've changed our methodology to make sure that our response rates and our overall integrity of our studies is keeping pace with these changes. We are now using what we call the mixed methodology. This was also similar to what we used in 2014, where we're using multiple recruiting methods. So this cycle was mail, email, and phone, as well as using both online and telephone data collection for the survey. So multiple ways to recruit people, multiple ways for them to participate. I will point out that in all of this, we had PIN numbers assigned to particular households, and so that way we could keep track of who would participate and who would not, and also we're able to ensure the integrity of the study by making sure that if you weren't invited to participate, you didn't have a PIN, you couldn't actually access the site, and you also couldn't take it more than once if you were bored that evening and wanted to stack the deck a little bit. This year we had a very strong response. We were contracted to do 400 interviews. We delivered 754 interviews. The reason for that was, in addition to in the past we've used mail recruiting to online and telephone to telephone, we introduced email this year as well. And so the recruiting method was even more comprehensive. And so we had a very strong response from your community. And now, because this was a sampling of 754 and not a census of all of your residents, it has what's known as a margin of error due to sampling. In this case, that's plus or minus 3.5%. That means we can be 95% confident that the results we'll talk about tonight are within 3.5% of what we would have found had we spoken with all of your residents. Okay, so on to the results. This first slide is the results to the question overall, how would you rate the overall quality of life in San Carlos? Would you say it is excellent, good, fair, poor, or very poor? I mentioned that we had done this study in the past, and so here's an example of a question that was asked identically in 2014, so we can show them stacked side by side. In 2016, which is that left bar, you had 96% of your residents rate the quality of life in the city as excellent or good. 2014, that was essentially the same at 98%. There were no statistically significant differences here between the two studies. One thing that's in the report that you don't see here is if you break this down, you start looking at it by subgroups of respondents, by age, by how long they've lived in San Carlos, home ownership status, where they have a child in the home. What we found is there wasn't a single subgroup that rated the quality of life in San Carlos as excellent or good at under 90%. So widespread perception in the community that this is a nice place to live. Now, following that question, we had a question where we asked if the city government could change one thing to make San Carlos a better place to live now and in the future, what change would you like to see? This is an open-ended question, meaning that we ask the question and we're quiet. We don't provide them with the list of responses that you see there on that slide. We simply record their verbatim responses, and then we go back and we review those verbatims and group them into the categories that you see here. And so as you can see in 2016, the number one was limit growth and development at 15%, reduce traffic congestion about 14%, and then improve or address parking issues at 14%, and then on down. I looked at the results to these in comparison to the last cycle, and it's interesting. Limit growth and development, previously number 7 on the list, now number 1. Traffic stayed about the same at number 2. Parking, what was number 1, is now number 3, but those top 3 are kind of all stacked up right next to each other. And this pattern that we're seeing in San Carlos as you look over time is actually pretty similar to what we've been seeing around the state and working with cities. And I've been doing this for a while, and prior to the recession, there were 3 issues that dominated community concerns in almost every city we worked in: growth and development and traffic, right? When the recession hit, those faded away and people were really concerned about the economy, right? Economic development, unemployment, jobs, etc. And you also witnessed, with unemployment being higher, lower peak period traffic congestion, right? And with the recession, a virtual halt to construction. And so concerns about growth and development sort of went away, and traffic went way down the list, and it was all about the economy. Well, this pattern here fits what we've been seeing in a lot of communities, which is I think the recession in the minds of the average resident is finally behind us. And you're starting to see construction and development getting traction again in this economy. You are starting to see traffic congestion being returning to some levels of where it was before, despite some of the improvements that have happened. And so there's this return to pre-recession patterns in terms of what voters really or what they're concerned about most and foremost in their minds. And so the pattern we're seeing here is kind of similar to what we've been seeing in other cities. Now, this question is the answer to the question, or this slide is the answer to the question. Generally speaking, are you satisfied or dissatisfied with the job the city of San Carlos is doing to provide city services? Because we're asking about the city's performance overall in terms of providing services, not referencing a specific service at this point, it can be considered an overall performance rating for the city. Again, we're showing 2016 next to 2014, and what we found is in 2016 you had 83% of your respondents say that they were satisfied with the city's efforts to provide city services. You had about 11% who were dissatisfied and about 6% who were unsure. This is a good, solid score. I've seen it as low as in the 40s. I've seen it as high as 98%. So to give you an idea. When you compare to 2014, what's interesting is if you roll the satisfactions together, they are not statistically significantly different. But when you look within the categories of satisfaction, there was a dip in the percentage very satisfied between 2014 and 2016. That was significant. And when you dig behind this to see kind of which sort of subgroups seem to have the lower scores overall, 2 groups sort of stood out this time. One was renters. were substantially lower, and then also the under 35 group had lower ratings when compared to all other respondents. Now, here is the overall satisfaction score. We also went on to ask about the specific service areas you see on this slide, and similar type of question where overall are you satisfied or dissatisfied with the city's performance of providing this particular service area. And as you can see, for the vast majority of the services that we test, you have at least 3/4 of respondents saying that they're satisfied with the city's efforts to provide these services. At the top of the list, providing library services, 98% satisfied, then holding special community events, providing recreation programs for youth, and on down. When you get to the bottom, you start to hit on some of those issues that we saw earlier when we asked that open-ended question about what the city government could change to make the city a better place to live. That's managing traffic congestion, public parking comes up again, streets and roads. Preserving community appearance is a little bit of a, the full wording of that is preserving community character and appearance through building and planning permits, inspections, and code enforcement. So there's a bit of a nexus to development there that in the wording of this that I think we're keying in on some of that. But when you look at these results compared to last time, this is where the action was in terms of where we saw some of the decline overall. So you saw some reductions in terms of satisfaction and traffic congestion in maintaining streets, community appearance, and maintaining a low crime rate was also an interesting one. The growth and development issues we talked about and I kind of understood and is part of a general pan. The police services one kind of threw me for a loop for a second until I talked with staff. I said, was there something going on in the community that you would have that? And it turns out I guess you had a rash of fairly well-publicized burglaries that weren't, you know, the burglary rate wasn't much different than it's been in the past, but the amount of attention that these burglaries received relative to the past was different, and the timing of the survey happened to land right when that was going on. So I think that there's a bit of an effect that you're seeing there because of that. Okay, so in terms of traffic congestion, at this point we're going to start to dig a little deeper in specific areas. One was traffic congestion. We asked residents to rate the traffic circulation, which we described as meaning the ability to drive around San Carlos without encountering long delays. How would you rate the overall traffic congestion, how would you rate the overall traffic circulation for streets overall on major streets in residential areas? And the results you see here, clearly they are distinguishing between, on the one hand, major streets, and then in residential areas you get two very different opinions about circulation in those areas. Overall, you had about 54% who said excellent or good for the overall traffic circulation rating in the city. Now, earlier we saw that growth and development went from being the number 7 issue in the community to the number 1 issue. And there could lead to the impression that, the community is really pushing back against growth and development. What's interesting is we dug deeper on this and we asked, okay, in the past 3 years, would you say that the pace of development in San Carlos has been too fast, about right, or too slow? And what you find is that about half folks said it's about right, 49%, about 12% said too low, about 29% said too fast, and about 10% were not sure or prefer not to answer. And so it'd really be a mistake to look at that traffic, the limited growth and development item as being the number 1 of the list of things that were said in the open-ended question, and conclude from that there's this big issue in the community and that the community as a whole was anti-growth and anti-development. That's not the case. What you see here is, for the most part, people think that the pace of development in the community has been about right over time, and you've got just under a third who think it's too fast. Now, we see some other questions in here on development which lead to some of the same conclusions. So, for example, one of the things on this next slide where we asked is recognizing that there's, development takes lots of different forms. And so we wanted to ask for each of the development types on this list for them to tell us whether they feel there's currently too much, about the right amount, or too little of this type of development in San Carlos. And you get a pretty dramatic difference of opinions depending on the type of development being discussed. At the top of the list, entertainment uses such as music and arts. That's the one item where you had at least half of the folks in the community say there's not enough of this in our community, right? And only 2% said there's too much. Retail stores are another one where, although the dominant answer was it's about the right amount, among those who felt that it wasn't the right amount, you had 21% who said there's not enough of it versus 5% who said there's too much. Other items that fit that same pattern, the other item that fit that same pattern was hotels, although the dominant answer is it's about right. The percentage who said there aren't enough hotels in the community was actually about 5% higher than the folks who said there was too much. For some of these other types of development types, that's lopsided the other way. But it gives you a sense of that, people's opinion about the type of development that's going in is going to affect their opinion as to that particular project. And here's another one which sort of, I think, puts the nail in the coffin in terms of the argument that the community, based on that initial sort of open-ended question, would be anti-development. The reality is they're not. Here's a question which says, in general, do you favor or oppose the city of San Carlos working with private property owners to redevelop older, outdated commercial areas in the city? 72% of your residents say they favor the city working in that capacity. So I think what you find here is a nuanced set of opinions in your community about development. They aren't anti-development, but they have their opinions about what type of development is appropriate, and they certainly see a need for redevelopment. Now, the city of San Carlos, like a lot of cities, has a limited budget and sometimes a seemingly endless list of things that could command that budget. And so the city, like other cities, has to prioritize among the things you could spend your money on. And so we took the opportunity in the survey to ask residents of the things on this list, which would they assign a high priority, which are medium priorities, and which are low priorities, and which are items that the city shouldn't fund. We asked these in a random order, but we sorted them from high to low here based on that combined percentage of folks who said it's either a high priority for future city spending or it's a medium priority. And here you see there's sort of two tiers to these results. At the top of the list, making improvements to storm drains to reduce flooding, accelerating the improvement of local streets, and providing additional parking downtown. Those were the three on that list that really stood out from the rest. I want to emphasize it doesn't mean that the things on the lower part of the graph aren't supported, but the nature of the question is we want to know your priorities, and we let them know that not everything can be a high priority, right? So compared to the things at the top of the list, these are viewed as lower priorities among your residents. All right. Switching gears a little bit to communication, we asked residents overall, are they satisfied or dissatisfied with the city's efforts to communicate with residents through newsletters, the internet, television, and other means? What you find is in 2016, 84% of your residents said they were satisfied with the city's efforts in this respect. In 2014, it was 85%, so very stagnant. Despite the fact that these are very similar results, I was struck by these findings because the pattern that I've been seeing in almost every city survey that I've done over the last 3 years is that communication scores are going down, right? That city after city that I've worked with that are high-performing cities, their communication scores have gone down notably. And I think it's a reflection of the fact that, on the one hand, the challenge of reaching residents on one hand is easier because there's all these different sources, but on the other hand, you're having now to communicate in all these different channels because people are turning to different sources of information and more diverse sources than they used to, right? It used to be easier. You knew you could hit the same 3 or 4 channels and you'd cover 90% of the population. That's no longer the case. And so that diversity of sources creates a challenge. The other thing I think is going on is that there's this increase in expectations, right? If I want to know something, I reach in my pocket, I grab out my iPhone, and I have the answer. And news is immediate, information is immediate, and so the expectations in this new world we live in sometimes make it difficult for a city to be able to provide that information at the same pace. And so against that backdrop of what we've been seeing in all these other cities, when I saw this result, I about fell out of my chair because I think it's one of 3 that I've seen in the last 3 years that have not gone down. And so you've been swimming upstream fast to be able to maintain the same levels of communication satisfaction as you were in 2014. Last 2 slides before we get to the conclusions here. Most of this survey focuses on residents' opinions with relation to city services, right, and facilities. But we also take an opportunity in the survey to ask residents how they view the city as an entity, in particular in how responsive the city is to residents' needs, how well the city manages its finances, how well the city listens to residents when making a decision, and we ask whether they trust the city of San Carlos. And we ask this because we realize there's more to good local governance than just having well-maintained streets and nice parks, right? And these are, comparatively speaking, very solid scores. We've got 69% on the first two, 61 with respect to city listening to residents when making important decisions, and then 76% of folks are saying they trust the city of San Carlos. That's a striking answer in part because, we're all, frankly, taught as good Americans not to trust government, right? That's part of our political ethos. And so when you ask that question, oftentimes you get a knee-jerk reaction from people. But your residents, think about it, and a large percentage of them say, yeah, I trust the city. We had about half of the respondents we spoke to indicate that they had interacted with city staff during the past year. And we asked them to rate staff in terms of their helpfulness, professionalism, and accessibility. And as you can see here, staff got very high marks across the board on all those, which is great. All right, and then on to the key conclusions. I spend more time in the full report, and so I'll just summarize here and again, welcome questions from council if there are any. I think the first obvious takeaway from the survey is that residents are generally satisfied with the city of San Carlos and its performance. We saw that with respect to the overall quality of life in the city, with respect to the city's overall performance in providing municipal services, as well as in a variety of very specific service areas. We saw that when customers interacted and residents interacted with city staff, that they provided high opinions of city staff. And we also saw that the city resident communication has remained high despite all the growing challenges I mentioned before. And so, to the extent that you look at this as a report card on the city's performance, this is a very good, solid report card. I can also tell you that, when you get some good, solid scores, these things aren't given, they're earned. I've worked with cities that when they've slipped, believe me, it shows up in these surveys. And so when you get good scores like this, it's certainly a positive commentary on the work that the city does and good leadership. Now, having said that, like any customer satisfaction survey, if you want to think of it that way, it should not just be about how are we doing today, but where do we have opportunities to improve into the future. And based on these results, there's some sort of clear areas that stood out from this survey as being your best candidates for service and improvements or attention in the future. Managing traffic congestion, providing additional parking downtown, managing growth and development, maintaining local streets and roads, and then making improvements to the storm drains to reduce flooding. So those, of everything in the survey, those sort of stood out as your best opportunities. So with that, I end my presentation, and I welcome questions or comments.
Thank you, sir. Questions for Mr. McLarney? Mark?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you. Very interesting presentation. And much faster to look at as you walk through it. It took forever to download onto my iPad. First question I have is on your fifth slide where it changes to improve San Carlos. The question isn't specifically related to that slide, but there's always a financial component to essentially trying to address some of the concerns. And I was wondering, is it possible in a survey like this to also ask a question of folks like basically, where's your sense of the top three sources of city revenue? In other words, what are they? Because I have a funny feeling that there's a significant mismatch between the reality and what people think it is, but I'd like to have some data on that.
There's been a couple of cities where we've dove into that question, and it's probably what you would expect, which is, folks for the most part don't have a good handle on where the city money comes from. They'll think it's all the property taxes that they pay go to the city. We know that's not the case, right? Sales taxes, same thing. And so, to the extent that we've done it in a few cities, it hasn't come back with that folks have a real clear idea about what the city's revenue sources are.
Well, I'll leave it to staff to consider that the next time we do this. I think some kind of question like that might be interesting. Just because I expect to hear what you're saying typically happens, but I'd love to know where the delta is so we can target communications about that and try and educate folks. On your opinion of different development types, which was slide 10, looking at the ones that had the largest reaction of, hey, there's too much of this going on, which was mixed-use residential, office, retail, restaurants, condominiums, apartments, and restaurants. when I saw that, it struck me that maybe what you're seeing there is not so much, given the context of the other slides, opposition to development or redevelopment per se, because you said there is support for that, but it might be just not wanting to see densification. Because, I mean, frankly, up until, well, shortly we'll be starting to build a number of large, high-density residential programs, but in the last 3 years we've hardly done any at all. So I'd just like to get your reaction to that.
I think there's certainly an element of truth to that. We've asked similar batteries of questions in other communities, and I can tell you that apartments almost always come in at the bottom, right? And for a variety of reasons. One is densification, right? The other is oftentimes if you're a homeowner and you own a single-family residence, what you want are other single-family residences in the community. That way you're maintaining overall property values and other things. I think there's certainly an element to that. The other thing you think about apartments is because they're denser and you can put more bodies in, it's going to potentially aggravate the other problem like traffic congestion or parking that people think of when they think of apartments. So
okay,
it's possible.
On your funding priority slide, number 12, the top item was make improvements to storm drains to reduce flooding, which I thought was interesting. Did you, by any chance, happen to see whether there was a correlation with the support for that one with the sort of region of the city? In other words, do a neighborhood type of analysis?
We didn't, but it's certainly possible.
I would be interested in seeing that because it's one of the ones we have talked about. There's certain parts of the city that are significantly exposed to storm events, and of course there are other parts up in the hills that are not. And I'd be interested to see what the split, if any, is.
Okay.
The number 14, which was the agreement with various statements about the city interacting with the public. Do we have comparable data for 2014?
We do. I'll have to dig
Yeah,
for it.
if you could provide that, I'd like to see that because I'd like to see what the change is.
Sure.
And then last question on page 15, opinion of city staff. I agree with you. I think these are good marks. You know, there's always room for improvement. But I was struck by. Did you gather any information from the comments to see whether there are certain functions within the city that are doing better or worse?
You know, we have tried that angle in a number of different communities, and what you find is that a lot of people responding to this question don't know, right? That they know they came to the city and they interacted, but they don't necessarily, I mean, if it's building and planning, they tend to know it's building and planning. Right. But if it's other things, they don't get their department allocations correct. And so then you start wondering, well, is this department getting an answer that's really relevant to them, or is somebody else getting mixed in? And so we've tended to drop that question.
Got it. Fair enough. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Ron?
Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I really only have one question on that. I think it was toward the end. Communication satisfaction has struck me that, you know, this time around there was, 8.6 very dissatisfied, despite the fact that we've added so many methods of you know, different ways to get information out to our residents. And I'm wondering if, you know, the fact that some people aren't happy with it is that maybe they don't like what they're seeing, and so then they are unhappy with the communication. You know what I mean? They don't like what they read, so they say, well, it's bad communication. Is there an element of that? Is there a way to measure that?
That's a great question. I don't have a definitive answer to that. I could certainly see that being, for some of the individuals in there, that being their issue. I will say that the other thing you will do when we do this research, you start looking across, okay, who are dissatisfied people, and then you track how they answer other questions. You tend to get low marks across the board from many of them. Some of them aren't very. If they're overall dissatisfied, they're going to give you lower marks on everything, including communication, right? Mm-hmm. And so I've yet to see a city that satisfies everybody. I mean, nobody's gotten 100% yet, right, in terms of overall satisfaction. But what I often like to do is you'll take your dissatisfied group and isolate them. And even though they tend to give lower scores across the board, you can go in and go, where are they particularly low relative to the average respondent, right? And that tends to be your clue to what it is that's driving their opinion, right, as a group.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. Bob?
My question was on, or a couple questions on number 5 again. I guess the fourth answer rather was not sure. Is that?
There you go.
Is that about where you get not sure in your history of doing things?
It varies community to community. We have had some communities where when you add up your not sure group and then you add your everything's fine, we don't need any changes group, it's been as high as, say, a third of respondents, right? I tend to look at your no changes needed and you're not sure, can't think of anything as a good answer. The reason is the nature of the question is, here's a soapbox, stand up on it and tell us one thing we can do better. And they say, I don't know. Or, you know what, everything's fine, we don't need to make any changes, right? That's, in an ideal world, that's the answer everybody gives, right? Again, never seen that either, but I wouldn't be alarmed by that question or to think that people don't think about these things. It's just the fact that, for a lot of people, they look at the community. We saw how highly they rated the overall quality of life. For some of them say, you know what, I really wouldn't want to change anything.
So, as I said, I guess I didn't ask it very well. Do you see that fourth on all your cities, or do you see it 20th? Do you see it first? Or
I've seen it be certainly top 3 in a number of cities. I've seen it where it's lower, like it is on this particular year cycle, and so it just depends.
Okay. And then the other thing is, like the 14s, is that a percentage? In other words, do you ever see, I assume you do, they come up with 35 or 40% of on that line or something?
Yeah, that's a good point. There was a city I worked on with this where 60% of the people said the same thing.
Wow.
And that was City Lake Forest when they were going to develop the El Toro Airport, right? And that was top of mind for everybody. So it's a huge red flag issue. I've been in communities where, 30%, a lot of times you'll see where 30% of people will say the same thing. In traffic, for example. You're always going to have something at the top of this list.
I understand.
Yeah, and that's,
but I was just looking at the 14 number. In other words, is that like an average top of the list percentage?
Again, it
depends.
It depends.
Yeah.
I would say typically you're going to find something that's a little higher than that.
Okay.
Like, if I do this same type of study in Southern California, you will often get traffic congestion being the number one, and it's going to be out past 15%.
I was just curious how that worked out. Thanks.
Yeah.
I'll ask, you have your light on, Mark, is that right?
Yeah, I can wait.
Okay, I'll ask a question or two. So, we've been hearing, obviously, that, in general, the American public is pretty dissatisfied with their government at a national level. There was an article in the LA Times not too long ago about how that sentiment is sort of trickling down and is creating kind of a negative view of local, municipal, state, county government as well. I'm wondering if you're seeing that in your polling at all?
In the questions that we're asking in these types of studies, I have not tended to see, where I see the trickle effect from what's going on in the election cycle, tends to be this question, which we have up here, about most important issues or changes. If immigration, for example, is something that's getting batted around in the national politics and state level politics, you will see suddenly immigration show up on a question like this. So it tends to be the topic area. I think that voters in general tend to be pretty good about distinguishing between their local representatives for city or school board, right, versus Congress, right? And in fact, one of the ways you know that is if you were to compare your scores in terms of your performance overall and how they feel about whether you listen to them or whether they trust you, and then you go look at the same scores for Congress, it's night and day, right? And so for the most part, voters do make that distinction.
Okay. And then could you go to slide 14 for me?
Sure.
And I was just looking for maybe a little bit more commentary. Is this a pattern? I mean, as you said, you thought these were pretty good scores. What I wanted to focus on the opportunity for improvement. And I'm just wondering, you see a higher dissatisfaction with listening, but at the same time you see, less dissatisfaction with, in a question of do you trust the city? And I wanted to see is this a similar pattern that you're seeing? Or should we read anything into those results?
I wouldn't, the thing I'd read into it is, again, there's always room for improvement, right? So this is certainly one of those attitudinal batteries that you're never going to see it be solid green. It just doesn't happen. To give you an understanding, I've worked in some cities where, their green bars barely crest 40%, right? I've worked in some where their dark green bars are a higher percentage. It's just always an opportunity area that you think, okay, how as a city can we work on, if this is the impression that they have of us, how can we improve this, right? I'll also say that I know that you went through a somewhat divisive ballot measure election recently. That could color some of the things that you see on these things. They tend to be temporary, but it can color that, because anytime you have election cycles and you have sides going back and forth about should we support this, should we not, it can color how people answer these questions, but that tends to be a temporary thing.
Okay. Thanks. Matt?
Thank you. I had a question about the chart. Let me find it here. Overall satisfaction.
Number 5?
I guess so, yeah. I don't know. I didn't number them.
Right here. 6.
There you go. Yeah. To me, I was a little concerned about the dark green. I understand that overall, if you take you've got about 83% in 2016, and then you've got about 87% in 2014. But should there be any concern that the dark green, at least, that's like a 22% change?
Yeah, it went from 42.8% to 32, right? So that's a statistically significant difference. I mean, anytime you see that pattern, the first question I want to say is, all right, why? Right? Why are we seeing a drop there? And that's why on that next, you don't see it in this graph, but on the next page when we go to here, and I was saying, overall we're here, the results we're seeing. Where was the action between 2014 and 2016 in terms of where did we see drops in satisfaction, to help us understand why that overall performance went down a little bit? And it's the same things we were talking about earlier. It's traffic congestion was one of the areas, parking, right? So there's a dissatisfaction in those things that are towards the bottom of this list, and those yellow and green bars, the yellow and red bars have sort of grown as a percentage of that total continuum. So that gives you an understanding of why, to what extent this has dropped 10 points. That's probably where you're getting it from. So people's concerned about those issues.
So that's a good segue into my next question, which when I look at the overall, the one that's in blue, I think we've been at it a couple of times, the overall satisfaction.
The numbers are in the right-hand corner.
Oh, they are? Here, let me find it then.
Are you in the full report?
I think so. No. Changes to improve San Carlos. That's the one. Number 5. Yeah. Okay, so when I look at that, I understand what you're saying, that if you go to San Diego or something, you might get 30% or something. But it appears to me that when we're just looking at San Carlos, which is what this is about, when you've got the only thing that's a bigger number, or excuse me, not a bigger number, but as you go up the chart, improve public safety 6.2 and no changes needed 5.8. So you're in the the 5s and down. Then you get this not sure is 11, but then you get this 14s. Those are 2 to 3 times as much as anything else.
Yep.
So it seems like that should be something we should be concerned about.
Well, you certainly should take note of it, right? That the number one issue when you ask people top of mind, what comes to mind as the thing that it would most like the city to change, 15% of folks said growth and development, right? Limit it. You had another 14% who said, I want you to reduce traffic congestion. You had another 14% who said parking. Parking's my issue, right? So I'm not trying to minimize them, but one could look at this question and the answer and say, okay, limiting growth and development was the number one response to this question at 15%. I take that as nobody in San Carlos is happy with the pace of growth and development, right, in the community. It's been too fast. And yet when we followed up on that question later, what you found is for the most part, folks were comfortable with it. It's a minority of your total population for which this is their hot issue, right? And so when you ask them this question, bingo, they hit on it, and they're large enough to, if they're all hitting on that same issue, to be at the top. But it's important to then go and look at some of those other questions and realize, okay, it's not that simple, right? That you have a portion of your folks who that is a hot issue and they'd rather have no development, but you have a larger swath, about half, that say, you know what, the pace has been about right. You have that other group, about 12%, who said it's not fast enough, I'd like to see more development. And then when you ask about should the city be engaging in working with private property owners to redevelop some of the older commercial areas, you get 72% of people who say yes. So that's what I meant by, if you just look at this question, you might come away with the idea that the community as a whole is anti-development or anti-redevelopment. That's not the case, right? It's an important issue to some folks, but it's not necessarily important to everybody.
But it could be a little bit, and I'm looking for clarification here, it's a little bit like what Mark was saying earlier, that the densification issue, it's like the difference between me saying to my wife, honey, why don't we double the size of our house? And she says, no, we don't need any more room, we've got enough, versus how about we remodel the kitchen and the bathroom and do some painting and everything, improvements. That's remodeling, kind of like what you're saying about, redevelopment, rejuvenation. People look around and say, yeah, we're a little tired and old. They might be for that, but they're not necessarily for, extensive growth.
And I think you do see that in that list that I showed where we were looking at the different development types.
Yeah.
Right? Their opinions about that vary depending on what you're proposing to build, right?
Good segue, because that was my next one, slide 10. So on this one of the things I took from this, and tell me if I'm right or wrong, is I either want like entertainment uses, that bar there, it's pretty balanced. You got 50 over here, 48 over there. Or if you get this thing in the middle, this dark blue, but not the darkest blue that's in the middle, then you want your wings on either side to sort of be equal. You wouldn't want, if you're like this one, let's say for instance, retail and restaurants and all that, you got the 57 in the middle, which is fine, but if you didn't have 20/20 on either side like that, it seems like you've got a problem.
Well, I don't know if you have a problem, as it tells you that as you can look down each one of these, right, where does the community sit? For the most part, on all of these, with the exception of the top one and actually except for the top one, you have the majority of folks saying, it's about right? We have about the right amount of retail. We have about the right amount of restaurants, et cetera. For anybody who thinks it's not about right, what I then look at is what's the relative proportion, right? Like you're saying, between how many people think it's not enough and how many people think there's too much. And I don't know if there's a right or wrong to that, right? Or do you desire it to be balanced? Do you desire it to be imbalanced? I don't know if I don't think there's a better or worse scenario for that. If you're thinking about, we have some use, we have some properties that we could redevelop, or we have some businesses that we'd like to attract to some existing facilities, you could look at the number one there and go, okay, clearly there's a perceived need in the community for some type of entertainment and music arts in the community. So let's start thinking about how we can attract some of that to the community. Beyond that, I see a lot of balance, right, for the most part.
Okay. Last question is, you're the consultant, you did this study. So if you were in our shoes, either as administration, city manager, or over here on this side of the dais, the electeds, is there anything you see in here that you'd go, I'd give some attention to this?
I think we've called out those top issues. What's interesting when you go through these results is that, when I compare the changes over time, the growth and development, traffic congestion, some of those things you can address as a city, right? Some of those things you can address with actual improvements. Some of those things like traffic congestion, look, it's an uphill battle. You're going to be dealing with it now. You're going to be dealing with it in the future. And although you can do what you can in terms of, street widening and traffic lights and whatnot, there's a real limit to what you can do as a city to improve traffic circulation. And so that's where the communication side comes in, right? And really helping to educate respondents. On the one hand, here are the things that we can do and we have the resources to do. Here are the things that we really can't touch because we aren't in charge of that major arterial, or it's inflow traffic from other cities, and there's nothing we can do about that. Kind of helping educate a little bit around those issues. So how much can you actually address through improvements, and how much of it is a communication exercise is something that you want to watch. The areas that I mentioned at the back in terms of your focal areas, those are the areas that I would say that if you have discretionary resources, discretionary time, you're thinking about what's our next news article going to be in the community newsletter, I would focus on those things.
Thanks, Matt. Mark?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Turning back to slide 6 for a second, the overall satisfaction column charts. You mentioned in your presentation that the one subpopulation that you looked at that had a significant difference or a significant source of, I guess, the somewhat dissatisfied and very dissatisfied were renters and people under the age of 35 or under. And I was wondering if you knew, roughly speaking, what the percentage breakdown looked like for those two classes, either separately or together.
I do. Hold on one second.
Well, I'm going to have to ask you a harder question then.
Under 35 is 17% overall.
When you say 17%, what is that? Very dissatisfied and
I'm sorry. I thought you meant as a proportion of your total resident base.
No. What I'd love to see is that chart with just that subpopulation.
I got you. Hold on one second.
I'm trying to get a sense of how big an issue it is for them.
Okay. So if you look at owners, for example, versus renters, owners had 85% say that overall were satisfied, okay? And then renters were 75%, so about a 10-point difference.
Okay.
And then under 35 was checking in at about 60, 75, 76%. So, in the renter category, some of the more action was in that very satisfied. That had a bigger dip relative to the somewhat satisfied. But overall, when you look at those two groups, they stand out in part because everybody else is so consistent, right? So when you look at it by length of residence, age, gender, child in the home, they look almost like the same bars going across. The two that drop off are those two groups, and it's about 10 points.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Any other questions? Is there anyone from the public who'd like to speak on this topic? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to item 8A, a study session on the sewer financial plan and rate updates. Mr. Walter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council. Jay Walter, Public Works Director. Tonight, for the study session, we want to kind of get you prepared because it's been 3 years since we've been here to talk about sewer rates. And so, of course, it's one of those things that we will be approaching now our springtime and the opportunity to be able to put rate changes on the property tax rolls in July. So tonight, I have with me Alex Handlers from Bartle Wells Associate. He's the consultant that's very familiar with the city's sewer wastewater operation as well as with Silicon Valley Clean Water's wastewater operations. So Alex has, again, prepared the sewer financial plan and rate update and sewer capacity charge update, which is something we want to talk to you about tonight. And then some of the next steps for how we'll move forward in the spring. So again, for the members of the public who may be watching at home and for council as a reminder, San Carlos, we serve about 29,500 businesses and people in San Carlos with about 11,000 sewer accounts. 90% residential, but we do have commercial industrial. And we have about 105 miles of sewer pipelines, 6 pump stations, and we send all of our wastewater to the Silicon Valley Clean Water Plant. And we take in wastewater from sewer districts from the county. So it is not just our own, but we have some extra that we convey. So to talk about finances and rates and to give you some background on the study that's been conducted, I'll have Alex come up and continue the presentation.
Thank you. Nice to see everyone. I'm going to try to walk through this pretty quickly. I won't go into a lot of detail. If you want more detail, you could feel free to interrupt me and I'll give a little more depth. Finances, everyone knows, this is a self-supporting enterprise, your sewer fund. Most of the money comes from sewer rates, over 97% in recent years, so you've got to keep those rates in line with the cost of service. The city's done a very good job when I look back over the last decade of raising rates most years, most recently with the last 3-year rate increase. So you've done a great job. You've gotten your sewer enterprise in improved financial health. You're in good shape now for what is coming down the pipeline, which the biggest thing is the Silicon Valley Clean Water Capital Improvement Program. The other thing is that capital improvement programs rolled out a little slower than anticipated, which has helped your finances in the near term. So you're in very good shape, but you do have challenges, and that concludes, I guess, what I was going to say. Where do you stand next to the other agencies? I mark this, you're in the upper middle range. You guys have done some heavy lifting with your rates in recent years. There's a lot of other agencies in this survey that are just kind of beginning this process of having to deal with refurbishing, replacing, rehabbing their wastewater treatment plants. You know, for example, San Mateo, the Palo Alto treatment plant that serves a number of agencies. So this is where you guys are now. It's just for informational purposes. Upper middle range, in line with a lot of other agencies. The biggest financial challenges you're facing, I think number one is the rebuilding of the regional wastewater treatment plant and the influent force main that conveys water from the Silicon Valley Clean Water member agencies to the plant. Originally, it was about a $350 million project, they thought, but when you start getting into it and figuring out what needs to be refurbished, it now is looking more like approaching an $800 million total project. A lot of the facilities are just very old. The treatment plant was put in over 35 years ago. It's at the end of its useful life. The influent force main is made a kind of a substandard pipeline that desperately needs to be replaced before anything major happens to it. Your share of this capital program is about $120 million, so pretty significant number for a city your size. And the biggest thing that's going to hit you in upcoming years is the debt service, as the program is funded predominantly by state revolving fund loans going forward, which is a very low rate state subsidized funding program that Silicon Valley Clean Water is trying to maximize the use of. Even with that, your debt service is going to be phasing up from about $1.5 million in the current year to about a little over $6 million over the next 8 years. So that's a big driver of the need for future rate increases. And also, you've got very old sewer pipelines here in the city. Some of it the city has addressed over time, but you still got a lot of pipelines that are at the end of their useful life, made of materials that today are considered substandard and are going to need to be refurbished. And the city's got a proactive program for dealing with that. We included $5 million a year for capital improvement, replacements, repairs, things along those lines. Final thing is operating cost inflation. You need a few % rate increase each year just to tread water. This just shows the capital program for Silicon Valley Clean Water. A lot of stuff happening in the next few years. So what we did, we developed financial projections to evaluate the need for rate increases. And essentially what we're doing is trying to get everything in there, look long term, and gradually set your rates on course to fund your long-term financing needs. And what we see is if you're going for steady annual rate increases, 5% rate increases is what it looked like you needed in upcoming years to keep things afloat and remain financially stable. The alternatives to that are, hey, you can defer rate increases in the near term, but that only leads to the need for a steeper flight path of rates over the long term, or vice versa. but we're generally fans of steady as you go. We find that's typically the most politically acceptable approach. This slide here just shows it graphically with the expenses. The blue expenses are the city's operating and capital costs. The green ones are Silicon Valley Clean Waters. And you can see the yellow arrow with the proposed rates just moves that red line right along line with the future projected expenses. In terms of your rate structure, residential connections pay fixed charges for the sewer service. Everyone used to pay the same rate regardless of whether it was single family or multifamily, and after the last rate study that was reevaluated a little bit more, and a couple of years ago you implemented reduced charges for the multifamily units that tend to have a lot less flow. Your commercial and other rates are volumetric based on metered water consumption that happens throughout the year. Your charges are collected on the property tax rolls, which on one hand is great. It minimizes the administrative effort, and you get 100% of the billings, but there's no late fees or things like that we'll come back to talk about in a minute. So basically, we went through a whole rate allocation process last time we went through this and got the rates back in line with the cost of service. At this stage of the game, after the reduction of this fixed charge for the multifamily residential folks, we didn't see any compelling reason to change your rate structure anymore. And keep in mind, if you do want to make any changes to the rate structure, there's a lot of ways of doing things. There's no single correct way, but anything that benefits one group tends to hurt other groups. It's a zero-sum game, so sometimes it's hard getting rate structure changes through because people think it's unfair. You're giving a break to one at the expense of another. In terms of the residential rate structures out there, basically there's three approaches that are used. One is, hey, charge all residences the same fixed charge. And you can see at the top there, Alternative A, that's roughly a third of the agencies in the Bay Area use this approach. Hey, we designed the system to meet the needs of all these homes, whether it's multifamily, single family, we don't care, everyone's got to pay the same. On the other side of the coin, Alternative C, at the lower end, you can see there are about a third of the agencies that have a variable usage-based component to their sewer rates. Some of these agencies have just had rates for many years that were based on usage. That's the policy that was put in place years ago, and often it's hard to change. You guys are now in the middle. You used to be at the top with everyone pays the same. You've kind of moved to the middle grouping there, the green section, where you recognize that multifamily or some subset of them has, significantly less sewer flow, so they pay a reduced charge. One other option we came up with, if you were looking at changing rates on the residential side, is you could come up with some notion of a reduced fixed charge, not only for multifamily, but also for low-flow single-family homes. No one else has this rate structure out there. We just wanted to bring it up as an option. Assuming no changes to the rate structure, what we were proposing is 3 years of 5% rate increases to keep your rates in line with what we're seeing as the future costs that are coming down the pipeline for you. This is what those rates look like. On the next slide, to put it in longer-term context, this is the charges for a single-family home going back to 1996-97. You had a number of years of no rate increases. Then you had a number of years, I think you were doing about 6-7% rate increases. With the advent of the Silicon Valley Clean Water capital program and need to totally rebuild the treatment plant and influent force main, it looked like you were a little behind schedule with your rate increases, so you had kind of a big bump up last time. Then again, looking to the future, looks like you don't need large rate increases, again, just about 5%. Over the long term, it worked out to be a little less than 7% compounded rate increases year after year if you were to adopt the proposed rate increases. The city has received a little input from some folks on fixed income, I believe, or hey, what can you do to help keep their sewer rates down? Last year, you implemented a low income discount program for your garbage rates, where people get a 10% discount if they qualify for PG&E's CARE program. The CARE program is a low-income and assistance program. The nice thing about piggybacking on the PG&E CARE program is you don't have to go out and try to income verify everyone. If they qualify for PG&E, they qualify for your program. So that 10% solid waste discount for a typical homeowner with a 32-gallon cart works out to be 10% of $31, or a little over $3 a month, about $37 per year. So if you wanted to implement something like that on the sewer side, you certainly could. It could be a percentage of the bill. Your sewer rates, keep in mind, are a lot higher than your garbage rates. You could also make it just a flat discount, something like $50 a year. The one thing you have to keep in mind, though, is that the discount cannot be subsidized from other folks' rates. That's what, you don't have things like late fees that you can use to fund a low-income discount program. In fact, you have virtually no revenues coming into your sewer fund that are easily accessible to give one group a break. So the funding very likely would have to come from your general fund. So it's competing with a lot of other resources if you wanted to move ahead with a program like this. We try to estimate what would the financial impacts look like. You've got about 1,400 folks who qualify in the community for the PG&E CARE program. A lot of them are multifamily residences who don't pay sewer rates. You just charge the property owner. So it's very difficult to get a low-income discount to a multifamily customer. You don't know how the lease arrangements work with these different folks. And I don't think you need to go down that path, because you just adopted a reduced charge for multifamily folks back in 2014. So they're paying a rate that's 14% less than single family. However, if you did want to move ahead with a low-income discount program for single family homes, the city estimates that of the 600 or so properties that are on the PG&E CARE program, about half would probably, somewhere in that range, would opt to participate in the program if the garbage discount is any indicator. So you're talking about 300, maybe up to 400 participants. If you applied a $50 annual discount, just as a hypothetical, you're talking about a program costing $15,000 to $20,000 per year, coming from the general fund. So we're not recommending it. We're just trying to give you the information. So if you want staff to come back with a program, we can certainly do so at the next meeting. So that's really the point of the sewer rate stuff here. We just wanted to present very preliminarily what we're seeing out there, get your input. The goal is we'd come back on April 11th with final recommendations looking for authorization to move ahead with the Prop 218 process. So that's sewer rates. Maybe we'll stop it there to get input on the sewer rate side. Then next we'll talk about sewer connection fees.
One second. Mr. Mayor, just for the council's decision, we do have the connection fee presentation piece to do as well. So if you'd like, we can go forward with that and then have questions at the end, or we'll do what you want to do at this point.
Anyone feel strongly about it?
I'd rather do it separately.
Okay.
Okay. Let's take questions then. Mark?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Going back to sort of doing this in order by slides, your financial challenges slide, you had an item, capital improvement needs estimated at $5 million per year. I just want to confirm, whenever I see round numbers like 5, was that the result, Jay, of the master planning review, or is it just that we have 5 fingers, so $5 million?
That was the recommendations from our 2013 sewer master plan.
Okay. On the next slide, which is the Silicon Valley Clean Water Capital Program, the lighter blue section called strategic nutrient removal, is that the phosphorus nitrogen thing? And that's not required yet by state law, but it's sort of imminent or possible?
That's correct. It's not part of the regulatory permit that Silicon Valley Clean Water operates under, but the regional board has kind of implied it's coming. So there's things they can do while they're developing the current program that's going to make it a lot more cost effective to account for the future permit requirements, as opposed to ignoring it for now. It's going to cost a lot more if they have to address it on the tail end.
So given the probabilistic nature of it coming, or perhaps when it comes into play, how did you factor that into the projections of what we need to do for sewer rates? Did you, in other words, is the 5% a year, does it contemplate that light blue money will be spent and the debt service associated with it will have to be paid or not?
Yeah, what we used is Silicon Valley Clean Water's latest financial plan, which is based off their updated capital improvement program. So the debt service that rolls in from funding nutrient removal is one of the components that's built into the debt service that San Carlos is going to have to pay. So it's built in to the 5%. I don't know what, looks like it's a pretty small part of that 5% overall, but it's in there.
Let me just leave it for me when staff brings this back. I would love to see sort of a sensitivity analysis on that combined with the latest and greatest sense of what's the likelihood that it's actually going to be required and when. Because the, you know, that's a, you're right, there's a relatively small portion of that bar, but it's still probably 20% of the height of the bar. So, and it's a bigger chunk of the increase. Couple of slides later on, your projected revenues and expenses. Thank you. I like the idea of keeping relatively smooth, in a sense, predictable rate increases. What happens to the extra money that we end up accumulating in 16, 17?
Yeah, you know, you've had, if you look in the prior year, there's a deficit. Because what's happening is,
right.
I mean, the extra money, I mean, you can use it for capital projects, you can maintain it in fund reserves. You've got a lot of capital financing needs, both here in the city and at Silicon Valley Clean Water. And what Redwood City did last year, they had a surplus that was a little higher than they thought because the Silicon Valley Clean Water program was coming on a little slower. So they contributed some cash to offset future financing needs. So that's something you would always have the option of doing. But the only reason why there's a little bit of a surplus in 2016-17 is because the city has been budgeting for these capacity assurance projects. I think you budgeted another $4 million this year, yet a lot of the work for those projects is going to be done next year, so there's just only so much capacity to do projects, and you've already built up some funding, so they weren't planning to do as much next year as in future years.
When this comes back, or Jay, even ahead of time, offline, you and I, unless in case nobody else is interested in it, I wouldn't mind seeing what a rate increase profile would look like without having that surplus. In other words, cover the deficit, but just if the increases from year to year are not identical for the first few years, but it's lower the first year and higher the second and 5% the third, I'm not necessarily opposed to that.
And that's an excellent point because, I mean, just, you know, you've got to go from here to here.
Right.
You don't have to go exactly straight. You could, you know, ease off the gas pedal the first year, then maybe it's a little steeper the next years.
It always looks awkward to some people that we're taking in more money than we need, okay? 2 slides further on, your nice historical long-term chart. Maybe it's 3 slides, 4 slides further on. I found this very enlightening, but I have to admit one question I have is what's the elevator speech answer to why is the average compound growth rate significantly higher than what most people would think of as inflation during this period of time? 6.9% is a relatively significant annual increase over a period of 20 some odd years.
You're right. I think, yeah, well, two things. One is inflation for utility agencies, at least according to various indexes that have been out there, have kind of implied that water, wastewater tend to be higher than consumer costs, which are, hey, you switch from Coke to Pepsi. It's very labor intensive, very capital intensive industry. So it's been more like, I'm going to make up 5%, somewhere in that range, 4.5%, 5%. So that's a big part of it. The second part is, a big part of it was the rate increase you did last time to elevate your rates to have to fund the wastewater treatment plant improvements. I mean, a lot of treatment plants were put in 30 to 40 years ago with the Clean Water Act. Not a lot of them have been rebuilt and replaced. So you're a little bit ahead of the game on that compared to some other regional agencies. So that, I think, has driven some of the larger increases in recent years. Your plant's at the end of its useful life, and you've got this 8-mile influent force main that needs some substantial investment. It's being addressed. Not every other agency out there has started addressing the same thing. Some will be, like San Mateo's got a similar capital program.
like
just starting on.
I like the concepts in your answer, and I don't mean this as a criticism, just a suggestion. I personally would like to see literally more of an elevator speech answer for that, to the extent we can get one, because I do get asked questions about that, and this chart is just going to bring them up. So I'd like to have a smooth, simple answer I can put out there.
Sure, we'll try to formulate a soundbite to explain that, or you could always delete the chart.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Ron?
Thank you. I just have one question for now. I think it was on slide 12. I counted up the cities that have all these rate structure alternatives, and I get 14 out of our 20 cities. What do the other 6 cities do, or other 5? I think it's 19 cities plus the county, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, this isn't all of them. This isn't all of them, and you've certainly got other agencies. There's like Half Moon Bay.
Some of them include those other cities. Okay.
Good point. Yeah, thank you.
That's all right.
Thank you, yeah. West Bay handles mostly Menlo Park and some surrounding communities. The wastewater districts don't perfectly match up with every city. Some cities do their own. There's also a hodgepodge of, the county has 10 sewer maintenance districts out there. But I think this is a lot of them in your area. It might not be every single one. We didn't try to do an exhaustive survey, but we, try to pull a bunch of them in to get a sense.
I just want to make sure there was an alternative E.
Well, there's a mix in each of these categories. Well, in A, they all charge the same residential rate. But when you look at, reduced charge for multifamily homes, some agencies, a lot of them in that category have something similar to what you have now. Single families here, multifamilies a little bit below. Sometimes it's a little lower. Sometimes they have 3 multifamily categories for mobile homes versus apartments versus condos. Sometimes someone like Sunnyvale might have it based on bedrooms. Whether it's 1 or 2 bedrooms, it's reduced charge. If it's 3 or more, whether it's multifamily or single family, we're just trying to give you a sense of the conceptual alternatives. Same in alternative C. Some agencies have 100% variable rates, like San Mateo's had that on the books for many years. They may consider changing that in the future, because as water uses come down, so have their sewer revenues. Other agencies like Belmont might be 60% fixed, 40% variable. So there's a bit of variation within there, but just to give you a sense of the conceptual range that we typically see out there.
And just to clear up my own confusion on this, by variable rate, do you mean it's based on their actual usage?
It's based on some measure of water usage. Now, it's very difficult to get an accurate measure of sewer discharge because it's impossible to meter. So what a lot of agencies do is they say, hey, we're going to say winter water use during the wetter winter months is a good approximation of what's really being put in the sewer system to try to eliminate the water use that's used for outdoor landscape irrigation. But even that's not perfect. So some agencies, have this metered water use as a component of how they figure out what their sewer bill is. But typically it's the winter water use.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. Matt?
First segue off of the questions that were just asked. It seems like if we wanted to get into the water use relative to sewer use mode of how we charge, wouldn't also drought years be a factor?
Yeah, they are. And a lot of agencies in recent years have seen even their winter flows come down, which has taken a bite out of their rate increases. San Mateo, for example, is at the cusp of facing a $800 million roughly capital program. They're just starting out. They've been doing 8 to 9% rate increases each year for the last 6, 7, 8 years, at least as long as we've worked with them, to try to get themselves in position for this. But their water use has also come down in recent years, and even the winter water use. So what they thought one year might have been a 9% rate increase, well, maybe it worked out to be a 5% revenue increase at the end of the day. So it definitely eats into your revenue stability as you move to usage-based rates. I don't know if I'm addressing what you're...
Yeah, you are. And that actually leads to my other question, that not because you said what you did, but it fits well. And that is, is there a way to determine, actual infrastructure costs? It's a little bit, here's what I'm getting at. Like Bob and I wrestled with this for a long time when we were doing Belmont San Carlos Fire Department. You got stations, you got trucks, you got engines, you got the stuff that you have to have whether anybody has a fire or not, or a medical emergency, and then you got use, right? So in this case, you have to have a sewer plant. If you had one house on a hill and it didn't have a septic system, and you had to have, then you've got to have a sewer plant, right? So in that regard, it doesn't matter how much you use it. So it seems like there would be a way to figure out, okay, how much does all this stuff cost just to have it? And then, okay, now we flip the switch, how much does it cost us to operate it? Because now you're looking at, okay, your demand on the operation is a different thing. Is there, do we have that kind of information that we could use to create a rate structure?
Well, it's a good concept, but what it comes down to is what's your perspective for you think how the costs should fairly be allocated is what I find. So you have some costs for operations, staffing, for example. That's a fixed cost, regardless of whether the sewer flow goes up or down. That staff is still there operating the facilities. Should that cost be recovered by fixed costs, the same for everyone? Many agencies have decided, yes, that's a fair way of doing it. On the other hand, you've got some agencies that say, hey, maybe we think it's better to recoup those fixed costs based on everyone's proportionate share of usage. So it becomes, I think, it's possible to do, but it becomes an exercise of what do we think is the fairest way of recouping costs, understanding there may be two divergent legitimate perspectives.
So again, my question was, how readily available is that information so that we could make that kind of decision? We could say, this is how we want to set up our rate structure, and we want to look at these things. And, for instance, we might decide as a council, yeah, the personnel, that's fixed costs. You got to have those people there no matter what, The only thing that we're looking at is the actual treatment of the sewage. That's not necessarily a fixed cost. It could go up, and the cost of treating the sewage could go up or down based on the flow, right?
You're right, and that's a very small portion of the overall costs. Okay. Probably less than 5%, with the chemicals and electricity that, not 100% sure, but yeah, in general, a lot of wastewater costs, a lot of it is the staffing and the facilities and the administration. So what you're left with is the utility costs are not a big portion of the pie at the end of the day. So probably, 5, maybe up to, I would say, yeah, somewhere in the 5% range would be my off the top of my head guess for what's truly variable. But by the same token, you could opt to recoup some of the other fixed costs via variable rates. We made up an option here. I think we made up, maybe you'd come up with a rate that's, 2/3 fixed, 1/3 variable, trying to balance what you're talking about with, you've got other policy objectives as well, so kind of come up with a mix of stuff there. Like you don't want to have your rates, you want to maintain your revenue stability on one side of the equation. On the other side, maybe if you wanted to move a little more towards usage, you could. Again, there's winners and losers if you do something like that. Someone with low flow who happens to be, maybe they go on vacation every January. That's part of the reason for their low flow. It's going to pay less. Someone with a larger family, maybe they're going to pay more. There's no perfect, but there's certainly a range of options.
We could be given that information so that we could take a look at it. I would like to see it because it'd be, that's in part what we were hit with when we made the changes we did is because the hotelers came to us and said, the hotel people and some apartment owners came and said, this really isn't fair. We're getting treated, as though we're a single-family house with 3 bathrooms and, laundry and everything else, and it's just not the case. So it'd be interesting to have that to use if we wanted to adjust our rate structure or how we charge. The other thing that I don't see here, I see all this emphasis on residential, but I don't see anything here about commercial.
Yeah, you don't. I think last time we went through that exercise of developing the commercial rates based on the estimated strengths of different types of commercial categories in relation to, the residential customers as well. So we kind of went through that last time. We didn't go through the whole exercise again this time of, sometimes it's.
And the other aspect of that is it's 10% of our accounts, so it is a pretty small percentage of
Commercial
our
is, yeah, okay. All right, very good. Thank you. That's all, Mr. Mayor.
Thanks, Matt. Bob, did you have any questions? No. Okay. Could we just briefly look at slide 10? So the big change from 2015 to 2016 is essentially there were some accelerated costs on the city capital side. Is that right? What project is that? And can you just give me a little brief understanding?
So what that represents is the tail end of the capacity assurance projects that we did as a result of the consent decree. So we embarked on those projects, began to do the design and implement the construction, and so we're at that final piece now. And that's where we'll have that big drop-off, because that was a fairly robust program. And then we'll move into what our master plan shows as the rehabilitation projects that we need to do for all of our main lines.
And this was the $5 million a year that Mark was asking about?
Yeah, for the master plan projects, there's $4 million a year for the repairs, replacements, rehab, plus there's $1 million per year in there, which staff was recommending for. There's always unanticipated projects, unique things that the city has to do each year that's outside of this long-term rehab program. So together, they total $5 million a year, with most of it being the master plan projects.
And this is the first time that I've seen sewer rates since I've been on the council. So have we historically put in about $5 million in capital per year?
Historically, you're like many agencies that have not been putting significant funding into reinvest in their sewer pipelines or water pipelines. There's a lot of pipelines that were put in 50, 60, 70 years ago. Maybe they've been fine for a number of years, but there's kind of like a tidal wave of pipelines that are approaching the end of their useful life that are requiring increased levels of investment. And there are a number of agencies out there that are trying to get ahead of it a little bit, or at least take a long-term look and say, hey, let's try to manage this on a pay-as-you-go basis. So you are one of those agencies. I'll put it out there.
And I remember looking back when we were here 3 years ago at what the level of output had been on the sewer projects, and what I was generally seeing was a project that was sort of in the 800 to 900,000 range per year, or we were seeing a couple of years where it got skipped. So it was not a consistent output, but there were projects being done, but nothing to the level of what we've now have the revenue and the master plan to guide us on.
Okay. Mark, your light is back on. You had another question?
Yes. Actually, a question and a quick comment relative to your question. Do you know roughly what percentage of the accounts are the multifamily residential accounts where we tweak the rates the other year? I mean, is it 10% of the accounts, 10% of the residential accounts?
Of your residential accounts, I think it was more in the 20% range, if I'm not incorrect.
Okay.
Just guessing, yeah.
That's fine. Jay, maybe you can let me know that offline.
It's on the slide. It's on the first slide.
Oh, I didn't see
no,
it.
he wants to, the breakdown of multifamily versus single family.
That was on the first slide.
That was residential versus commercial.
90% residential.
Yeah, that's residential versus
both.
commercial.
Yeah.
That includes both. The comment I was going to make, Cameron, is Jay has a really good presentation with videos about what the sewer lines look like in San Carlos that I strongly recommend you watch. However, do not eat before you see it, because it'll highlight just how bad the system got. Which you can actually see in the throughput numbers, because every time it rains badly, the rate goes up, and that's because of all the leaks in the pipes, all the leaks in the system. So.
Got it. Okay, Matt.
Just, I had a kind of a question / comment, because Mark was asking for, kind of like the bumper sticker answer to people that are concerned about rate increases. It seems to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, part of it, the bumper sticker answer is it's the price you pay for ignoring a system for so long in the infrastructure, and then suddenly addressing it. If we had, back from the implementation of the plan itself back in the 60s, if we had always, put some money into the capital improvement program and then actually done capital improvement on an ongoing basis, probably our costs wouldn't be nearly what they are today to do all these improvements all of a sudden out of desperate need almost.
Yeah, I mean, and they've brought it up at the same issue at the Silicon Valley Clean Water level. Hey, maybe we should, set aside a little bit. So I know they're trying to address that, looking into the future to make sure there's some cash going to be available at the end of the line, so it's not starting from ground zero. But that said, I mean, you put in a lot of these facilities, and they're fine for a number of years. They don't need a lot of investment for a long time. And so it becomes hey, do we want to start raising rates now for something in the future, or do we want to wait? It's almost like a policy decision. But you're right, yeah, the rates are a now or later game. More now means less later, and as other agencies have found, less in the near term means, steeper rate increases over the long run.
Through the chair, there's also another element, Matt, too, which I was fascinated to learn. The original Silicon Valley Clean Water plant was about 85% paid for by the federal government. Basically, they gave us a free water treatment plant, and then we ran it into the ground. So
it served its purpose.
And through the chair, Matt, in 2006, when I came on the board down there, I said, well, where are the reserves?
There were none.
There were none. So that's exactly the combination of what Mark said and the previous administration down there said, we'll just fix that. We'll put a Band-Aid on that. They never set up. And that's why if you look at the rates, and then I got
on. Jeff, you wanted to weigh in here?
Yeah, since we were talking about the elevator speech, I was just going to add my 2 cents. And certainly a big part of that speech needs to be the fact that simply not enough investment was made in the system or the plant for decades. And the other half of that, and this is very important to keep in mind too, is we don't set the regulations here. Neither does Silicon Valley Clean Water. We're not the regulatory agency. Those regulations are heaped on us by state and federal government, and we simply have to comply. And other people can pass all kinds of great laws in the name of having a clean water and a clean bay, and those certainly are laudable goals, but they're also very expensive goals. And we continue to see those regulations increased year after year after year. Every time we go for a new permit, there are new requirements, and we can look at some of the data here and see potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in requirements that we're anticipating that that certainly didn't exist in 1980.
Absolutely. So would the council like to give direction on this, on the rates specifically, or should we move on to the other presentation? What did you say?
I forgot the other one.
Should we take
direction, Jay? You want direction?
Yeah. Actually, I'm hearing kind of a consensus on the council that you see a need for the rates to be adjusted. You see, you're understanding what's all in the components of the revenue that's required and why it's needed, and that this appears to be a reasonable approach towards kind of keeping us in line with where we're headed with both our own needs, capital and operational, and Silicon Valley Clean Water capital and operational needs as well. That's kind of what I'm sensing. I'm hearing that maybe there's also some desire to hear about a variable rate component option, just to kind of have it out there for discussion, just to see what it might mean, and to sort of entertain the idea that, well, maybe there is an approach that we can take that would allow for some, say, different treatment based on the water use that comes. So that's kind of the way what I've heard and what I would be thinking about for the April meeting.
Matt, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, the only, when it comes back to us, I want that portion that talks about the tying to PG&E discount for seniors. I want that included in the report so that we can either act on that or not act on it.
Okay. Ron?
I'm satisfied that we're moving in the right direction. My thing is I just always want to say options. Even if they're bad options, just because then we can explain those things to the public when they come up and say, well, why are sewer rates so high? We can say, well, why didn't you do this? Well, here's why. So it's always nice to know the options, even the ones that makes no sense.
I'd like to weigh in. I don't really disagree with anything that I just heard. I'm probably a little bit more leery is the wrong word, less interested in seeing the variable rate discussion, just because that can get into an enormous cost accounting exercise and, playing games with stuff. I seem to remember that when we looked at the at the cost profiles based on the multifamily housing complaint, didn't we end up, the rate reduction was about 14%? We put a 14% variable. So essentially what implied in that is we're saying that fixed costs are about 86%. That's one way of looking at it. They're about 86% of the cost profile, which it sounds like probably is on the low end of what you would argue is really the true fixed versus variable thing. Happy to go through that discussion, but I'm almost thinking that based on some of your comments that maybe we need to revisit that rate and raise the rate a little bit, because maybe we cut it too far. I don't know if we want to get into all that.
Okay. Anyone else? And Jeff, your light's still on. Did you have anything else you want to say? No? Okay. Well, shall we move on to the second stage of the presentation?
Yes, let's go ahead and do that. And the other aspect of our study session tonight is to talk about the sewer capacity charge, which in other terms in our municipal code is called the connection fee. So essentially this is the fee that we charge for new development that occurs in the city. So when a new sewer connection is made, or when a property redevelops and the use changes and there's a different type of sewer connection or number of sewer connections that are needed, we charge a connection fee. And I'll let Alex walk through the presentation quickly so we can get to the questions and you can understand kind of where we are today and where we've been.
Yeah, so these charges haven't been updated in many years. This is the charge the developer pays, not the ratepayers. You don't get a lot of connection fee revenues because you don't have a lot of undeveloped properties, probably mostly redevelopment going forward. Your current charge is $4,500 per residential dwelling unit, whether it's single family or multifamily. It doesn't differentiate. And a parallel on the commercial side, it's $4,500 for each 270 gallons of estimated flow. Now, that's the 270 gallons is what's also embedded in your current $4,500 fee. So the two issues we see, the key issues are, one, this fee hasn't been updated since 1990. It's been over 25 years. And number two is this $4,500 fee includes not only the city's connection fee for its buy-in for its assets, but it also includes Silicon Valley Clean Water's sewer connection fee. And what's happened is over time, Silicon Valley Clean Water has changed their fee, meaning you get left with the remains. So this slide here, the blue section is of that $4,500, what is San Carlos's fee that they collect from each new residential dwelling unit? The orange is what Silicon Valley Clean Water gets. Looking back to 1990, you used to get over $4,000 per home. Well, as Silicon Valley Clean Water has increased their fee or decreased it, the amount, the remainders falling to you have bounced around a bit. Currently, you get a little bit more than half of the $4,500 total. This slide is kind of interesting here. It shows the other thing, the history. You look at what you were getting back in 1990, which is on the left side of this chart, and the blue line trails what you've been collecting from each dwelling unit over the years, which has changed, again, as Silicon Valley Clean Water has taken a bigger portion of that $4,500. So you're currently getting, not quite half of what you were getting in 1990. At the same time, if you were to escalate what your fee was in 1990 by the Engineering News Record Construction Cost Index, which is a widely used measure of construction cost inflation, you can see that your fee now would be almost $9,000 just for the construction cost inflation. Really, you're getting $2,300 and change. So those were the two telling graphs that kind of tell the story, kind of the backdrop of what we were proposing to do. We're proposing a new fee based on what I call a system buy-in approach. Pretty much takes, hey, what's the cost of all the facilities to serve our customers through build-out, and divided by the total service capacity for what that system is going to serve. So the costs include things, the biggest thing is your sewer collection system pipelines. There's not an exact science for valuing what they're worth, so we use kind of a conservative approach based on input from staff. We included other assets such as fund reserves, which are a small part of it, but your sewer customers have contributed to fund reserves. Someone new coming to the system theoretically should buy in for a proportionate share. So you've got about $178 million of existing assets. We included capital improvements that were upgrading the system. You have $8 million of capacity assurance projects added in there as well, but we excluded repairs and replacements to make sure we're not double counting an existing asset and its replacement. And in total, we come up with about $186 million of assets for fee recovery. We know that's a conservative number. We divide that through the total capacity through build-out, and that capacity is what the master plan estimates is coming from actual sewer flow, not including infiltration and inflow from rainwater or moisture in the ground. So pretty simple calculation. Total costs, $186 million divided by 3.27 million gallons per day. It's a cost of a little less than $57 million per million gallons, or about $56.90 per gallon per day to buy in for a share of the sewer assets that are owned by the city. What does that mean for a single-family home or multifamily home? Well, we applied that $56.90 per gallon per day by the estimated flows that were documented in your wastewater master plan. A single-family home has a 190 gallon per day flow, lower than the 270 gallon per day estimate that was out there in 1990, and water use has indeed come down quite a bit from 1990. The master plan estimates a multifamily dwelling unit at 120 gallon per day flow, a little over 60% of single-family flow. So the fees associated with that are simply, 190 gallons per day times $56.90 per gallon per day. It's $10,800 and change for a single-family home. Multifamily home would be about $6,800. On the non-residential side, the recommendation is to charge per 100 gallons per day. It's a little bit of a deviation from what you currently do. What you currently do is charge based on single-family equivalents. I won't go into it, but going forward, commercial would pay based on 100 gallons per day of estimated demand. So this is just the city's fee. It excludes the Silicon Valley Clean Water portion, and it's important that you kind of make a break there so that your fee can continue to recover your costs. Looking at a survey of what other agencies in the region are charging, again, this isn't every agency out there. Your fee is currently kind of on the lower side. No surprise, it hasn't been updated in many years, as have some of the fees to the left of you. Redwood City hasn't updated its fees probably in at least 20 to 25 years. San Mateo has not updated its fee, and I would guess around the same time frame, and I think the same for Foster City. So a lot of them on the left are folks who haven't updated their fees in many years. Not all of them, but a number of them. You'd be moving from somewhere in the lower range to something towards the, I'll call it the upper middle range again, if you were to implement this single-family charge that's being showed here. The other thing I want to point out is the ones with the green in there, that's the Silicon Valley Clean Water agencies. So you've got your charge plus the Silicon Valley Clean Water charge that's shown in this survey. Other basic recommendations for the sewer capacity charge. Redevelopment projects don't have to buy in from scratch. They just pay for the incremental increase in demand. Going forward, I think, and we'll work with your legal counsel to make sure this is done appropriately in whatever ordinance is adopted. But under the JPA agreement with Silicon Valley Clean Water, the Commission for Silicon Valley Clean Water adopts its own fee and requires the member agencies to implement and charge the fee. This doesn't mean you have to adopt it as your own fee. We perceive this more as you have to administratively collect the fee and passed it through to Silicon Valley Clean Water. And along the lines with that, if the master plan is now saying a single-family home is 190 gallons per day, well, that should be the basis for what you're recovering for Silicon Valley Clean Water, as well as your own fee, not the current 270 gallons per day that's currently being used. We know this is a big increase in the fees. It's a big increase because, again, the fee's been on the books for 25 years and hasn't increased. We think it's substantiated. It doesn't mean you have to implement the full fee if there was any reticence to do so on your behalf. We've certainly worked with other agencies where we calculate what the fee could be, and they say, well, we're going to phase in over a few years. So you always have the authority to do that. And in the future, we recommend don't let the fee just sit where it is. You can escalate it each year by the Engineering News Record Construction Cost Index to keep it moving in line with construction cost inflation. And that's about it on the capacity side. I want to open it up for questions and input.
Questions, Mark?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good presentation. First question actually may be for Greg. Are we allowed by statute to have a fee structure which basically says it's two parts, the Silicon Valley Clean Water fee plus our fee, and the Silicon Valley Clean Water is whatever it is? So if they change it one day, it automatically changes on our schedule, or do we have to actually vote to adopt their new number?
Well, I don't remember if Silicon Valley Clean Water is doing their own 218 process. I remember that was being discussed, but an agency has to do the 218 process. So
I thought we just said this is not subject to 218.
Oh no, the capacity charge. Yeah, the capacity charge has to follow its own government code section, but not the 218. But yes, it's got its own.
So well, let me then. I momentarily forgot that. We are allowed to separate it because we're a member of the JPA, the Joint Powers Agreement requires us to collect for the other agency. So when the other agency tells us based on their information, this is the connection charge, we're allowed to take that information into account and collect that fee on their behalf and then set our own charge. And I'm not sure if it has to be separated on the property tax bill, but we'll look at that.
Thank you. For what it's worth, my preference would be that we do something like that so we don't forget to adjust this for 20 years and find out that, they've adjusted theirs over the course of time. The more substantive question I have, I want to make sure I understand how we came up with the updated sewer capacity charge calculation. It sounds like conceptually what we're doing is saying it would cost X dollars to replace this, to build de novo the sewer system that we have, leaving aside the Silicon Valley Clean Water stuff. Okay, that's your $178 million. Is that correct? Is that sort of a replacement cost thing?
Yeah, it's not 100% replacement cost, but yes, to a large degree, that's correct.
Okay, the reason I assumed it was because you said you could escalate the resulting number by the cost of inflation, of construction inflation. So I was assuming it was a replacement cost concept. So basically what we're saying is like, okay, dear property owner, if you had been around when we built this system, we would have tied you into it. It would have been a little bit bigger, a little bit more expensive, and your piece would be X dollars. And we're doing that by saying the overall system is got so much cost. It's designed to handle so much flow. You're contributing some portion of the flow. Your pro rata share is X dollars. Is that conceptually correct?
Essentially, you're putting in a pipeline to serve 100 folks. You got to put the pipeline in advance to facilitate the growth. Then as people connect, they have to pay in for their 1/100th share of the pipeline. So all we did was take the cost of that pipeline and bring it into current dollars, and you got to pay in for your proportionate share.
As if you had been there. And so that, I want to check my understanding, one last piece then. So take, for example, some of the lot subdivisions that we're looking at. There used to be one home on the lot, and now the lot's going to be split in two, and there'll be two homes. Basically, after the lot subdivision and construction, there's only one additional fee that gets paid, correct? Because the earlier home already was presumed to be part of the system. So it's not if you tear down a house and rebuild it. It's was it there? Did it already have a sewer connection? And if you add a sewer connection because of a lot subdivision or there was a vacant lot someplace and somebody built a home on it. That's the only time you actually end up paying this fee.
Yeah, that's correct. It's only for new development. It's not the existing ratepayers, and it's only for the increase in demand. So if you took a lot and split it in two, one house already has this covered from way back when. It's only the new house that would pay the fee.
Which leads me to believe that the actual dollar financial impact of this, and I support making the change, is probably relatively small, just because there's not that much new development going on in San Carlos other than some of the major multifamily stuff. I'm thinking in terms of single-family home stuff.
You're correct.
Okay.
Yeah. The big change where it would be is if you had a single-family lot that was converted into a condominium development, and so maybe you would have, instead of the one, you might have, a dozen or 15.
Right.
So that's kind of where we see the biggest change that would occur in that kind of situation.
Got it. Thank you.
That's right. This is not going to be a huge portion of your revenues because you don't have a lot of vacant land to develop.
Right.
You have some redevelopment that'll contribute towards it. Right. And every dollar you collect from these capacity charges is, a dollar less you need from the ratepayers. So.
Thanks, Mark. Bob?
My question is the legacy project, it won't be affected by this?
The Transit Village?
Transit Village. They would be, I believe they have already received they've applied for their building permits, so they're based on the old fee. So we would not be charging them the new fee. This would not be in place in time for that.
How about for the Wheeler Plaza?
Wheeler Plaza, I'd have to check on that one. I'm not sure.
Okay, because that's a lot of units. That's 100 units.
Absolutely right.
That's $800,000.
Yeah. We'll check. We'll include.
Should have been doing this 6 months ago.
Well, whatever. But I'm just asking the questions. Whether I want to do it or not, it's another
We'll
story.
include the new developments. We have to come back to council on April 11th with this. We would introduce it as an ordinance then. And so we'll have that information based on the developments we have in the very near future and ones that are already in the pipeline, whether this would apply or not.
And then once the ordinance is voted on, it's 2 times, right? And it doesn't go into effect until the second time. 30 days.
30 days after this.
Right, okay. I mean, I say that, excluding those two, there's the one kitty corner to the library, which is, 20, 30 units?
But long ago entitled.
Long ago entitled.
Yeah,
Okay,
so
I'm just asking because I'm thinking of the ones that, but the point that was made by Mark, and we just had one a month ago, where you took down a single-family house and you put up 8 condominium units, and so that would be another $64,000 or whatever, let's say, that, or $50,000 to $60,000 they'd have to pay in addition.
That's right.
And that's done more often. I should say more often, but it's done. That could be done more.
That's right.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Thanks, Bob. Matt?
That was going to be my exact same question, and I'm disappointed to find out that we're a day late and $1 short, so it's too bad.
My question, Jay, is what's the staff cost for a sewer connection? So outside of the cost of the system, what's our cost in City Hall?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
So
processing the permit, is that what you mean?
Yeah, do we have to do an inspection? Does anyone have to go out on site? Is it just issuing a permit? Is there?
Absolutely. So it'd be the building division would have any and all of the plumbing and all the features that are on site. Public Works would take on the sewer lateral and or new laterals that would be part of any connection to the main. We would have to inspect it. We would review the plans and kind of go through the process like we do with any new development now currently. So there's not extra staff time that's associated with this. It's just a different permit fee that would be charged based on the impact of the system.
But I guess my question is, when you looked at the fees, did you take into account, what's the cost to the city for doing that work? And do you feel like the current charge covers the cost of that? To the degree that you're focused here on, the sort of the cost of the overall system, should staff cost be supplemental to that? Should it not be factored in? Like, how do you think about it?
So it was, I believe it was 3 years ago, around the same time that we took a really good, thorough look at the all of the staff costs that are related to our user fees and the time that's taken to process permits and those kind of things. So we would have had that information included at that time. So I feel confident based on that review that we're getting and being compensated accurately for the time that we spend on these various things. And as I understand it, possibly next year we'd be looking at that user cost allocation again. And so we'd have another chance to revisit that issue.
Okay. But that's typically how we've looked at user fees. Is that not true about basically pay for the cost of the staff time? So can you just tell me a little bit like why this is significantly different than that? Is it just because you're essentially buying into an asset? I mean, I understand that point, but why not consider staff time?
Through the chair, can I offer perspective based on my own experience?
Sure.
When I built my house, I learned about this because building was going to charge me a sewer capacity connection fee, and I said, wait a minute, there's already a house there. I'm tearing down the old house. We already had a connection. And they said, you're right. You don't have to pay that fee, that particular fee. But I had to pay for the inspections that related to the new sewer line being hooked up to the main. So basically, what you're paying for here is literally just capacity. You're not paying for the pipe itself. And if you have a pipe that you're putting in, you got to pay to have that inspected.
Okay.
Those are separate charges for the permitting and the staff inspections and things like that.
And so then lastly, the reason that you would not want to raise this fee is if it would have any detrimental impact to, basically people choosing to do good development in San Carlos. Do you have any evidence to suggest that there's any price sensitivity to these kind of fees and whether it discourages development? And
that's a good question. There's always every developer out there will say higher fees discourage development because they're going to always sell their property for the maximum market rate they can get. So to the extent it costs them a little more to develop it, that's money out of their pocket. Then again, there's been other studies showed that agencies have higher development impact fees that have been putting the infrastructure in the ground to facilitate development. That's sometimes where the development occurs. But I think it's a little mixed. The level of fee here, I remember there was, I think, a survey that was done of a number of Bay Area agencies. Redwood City was trying to compare their development fees to everyone else. And kind of the gist that came out of it was if they were going to do, multifamily development or redevelop their downtown, if the fees got too high, it would require them to do an extra story to recoup their charges. But this seems to be a pretty small sliver of costs compared to the dollar value of what properties are selling for in this area.
And sorry, I sort of lost my train of thought. I had one additional question. Was there anything you wanted to add to that, Jay?
Only just thinking about 10 years ago, what single-family homes were going for in San Carlos, $4,500 connection fee at that time. And today, what they're going for, and we currently have a $4,500 connection fee. We're basically talking about almost tripling it, 2.5 times. And I think that it's an increase, but I don't think it's significant compared to the value of the homes that are being sold these days.
Great. Thank you for filling in some time while I remembered the question that I was going to ask, which is the revenue that comes in, does it go into the general fund or is it dedicated towards sewer?
It stays in the sewer fund.
Okay. Great. Okay. Any other questions of staff? Any public wishing to comment on this item? Seeing none. All right. Staff direction. Anyone care to, you want to summarize or does anyone have strong opinions?
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, sir.
On this particular portion of the presentation, I wouldn't mind when they bring it back if staff has a little bit of information on other agencies that have phased in, if anybody else has had a significant change of 2.5 times in the fee. I'd just be interested in seeing how common that is.
It's not that common, but some agencies have opted to do it, yeah.
Bob?
We'll try to get some data.
I think my only point was on a one-off. I don't have Mr. Jones wants to build a house on a vacant lot, or they do, great. I don't think 8,000 makes a bit of difference, but if you have multiple units, that's why I was asking what the list of multiples are, because when you start to build 100 units, that's $800,000. I mean, it's real money somewhere, and I believe me, I understand that it gets passed along. Trust me, I know that. It gets passed along. So again, you're trying to figure out, and again, the value of the property is way more than it used to be, but I'd still like to know the numbers. So.
Other comments? All right. Jay, do you have what you need?
I do. I do, Mr. Mayor. And so what we'll do at the April 11th meeting, we will have an item that will be the discussion of the sewer rates themselves. And we will ask the council to recommend a rate strategy going forward and tell us to issue the Prop 218 notice for the public hearing that we will have in June. We will have a separate item that will introduce the ordinance for the capacity charge increase. And so there'll be kind of two separate items that night, but we'll have the information that you've asked for on both of them and kind of walk down the path towards implementing both fully by the time we get to July.
That sounds good. All right. With that, meeting is adjourned.